The moment Eliza Rowan stepped down from the stagecoach, Gideon Hale looked her over, the way a man looks at a bad investment. Once, thoroughly, and with immediate regret. He didn't say hello. He said, "You won't last a month." She was 29 years old, wearing a coat that cost more than his saddle, and carrying a leather satchel that had never once touched dirt. The ranch she'd inherited sat 6 miles outside Coldwater Flats, Wyoming, and it hadn't seen a functioning fence in 2 years. Gideon crossed his arms. "No offense, ma'am, but this country has a way of sending city people back where they came from, usually before the first snow." Eliza looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up her own trunk, walked past him, and didn't look back. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who hadn't earned the right to doubt you, you already know how this story ends. But the road there? That's what we're here for. Hit the like button, drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's begin. The stagecoach pulled it into Coldwater Flats on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and the dust hadn't even settled before people started talking. It wasn't every day that a woman arrived alone in Laramie County, not a widow coming to join family, not a missionary with a church behind her, but a single woman traveling alone with 2 trunks, a satchel, and a deed to land that most of the county had already written off as worthless. Word had spread the week before that old Silas Rowan's niece was coming to take over the ranch. The postmaster had told the blacksmith, who had told the feed store owner, who had told everyone else within a 10-mile radius, because that was how news traveled in a place where entertainment was scarce and speculation was free. By the time the coach stopped in front of the Coldwater Flats General Store, there were at least 8 people pretending not to watch. Gideon Hale was one of them. But he wasn't pretending. He stood with one boot up on the bottom rail of the hitching post, arms folded, hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. He'd come to town to pick up a part for his water pump, and he had every intention of doing exactly that and nothing else. The Rowan Ranch shared a fence line with his property for nearly 1.5 miles. Whatever happened to that land was his business, whether he wanted it to be or not. The coach door opened. A gloved hand emerged first, then a pale green coat that was entirely the wrong color for Wyoming and entirely the right quality for a city that cared about such things. The woman who followed it was not what he expected, though he couldn't have said exactly what he expected. She was younger than he'd imagined, somewhere in her late 20s, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a hat that was already losing its battle with the wind. She was not small, not delicate-looking, but there was nothing about her that said frontier. Everything about her said parlor. Library, the kind of woman who corrected grammar and kept her hands clean. She stepped down onto the street and immediately assessed her surroundings with the kind of careful, unhurried attention that surprised him. Not wide-eyed, not flustered, just looking, taking inventory. Then the driver dropped her second trunk onto the ground with a sound like a body falling, and she turned to deal with it without waiting for anyone to help her. Gideon had meant to stay where he was. He found himself walking toward her instead. "Miss Rowan?" He said it without thinking. She looked at him with eyes that were a shade of gray-green he hadn't expected, and he noticed immediately that she didn't smile the way women usually smiled at strangers who addressed them. A little uncertain, a little grateful. She just looked at him levelly, the way you look at someone you're willing to hear out but haven't yet decided to trust. "That's right," she said. "And you are?" "Gideon Hale. My property runs along your north fence line." He paused. "Or what's left of it." "I see." She bent and tested the weight of the trunk, then straightened and looked around for something to use as a dolly. There wasn't one. "Do you know where I can hire a wagon? Manny Pruitt has one, stores 2 doors down." He didn't offer to go get it. He was watching her to see what she'd do. She pulled off one glove, tucked it in her pocket, then picked up the smaller trunk herself and moved it to the side of the road so it wasn't sitting in the middle of foot traffic. Sensible. Practical. He noted it but didn't revise his opinion. "Thank you," she said, already moving toward the general store. He stepped ahead of her. Not to be helpful, he told himself, just because he was going there anyway. "Miss Rowan?" She stopped. "I don't want to be unkind," he said, "but I knew your uncle. Good man. Worked that land hard for 30 years and still couldn't make it turn a profit after the creek shifted. The cabin needs a new roof before winter. The north pasture hasn't been grazed in 2 seasons. and the barn lost 2 of its posts to rot last spring. He looked at her coat again. Whoever told you this was a good inheritance wasn't familiar with the property. Eliza Rowan looked at him for a moment. No one told me it was a good inheritance, she said. My uncle left me what he had, that's all. She tilted her head slightly. Is there a reason you're telling me this? Because winter comes early up here, Gideon said, and it doesn't make exceptions for people who aren't ready. Something shifted in her expression. Not hurt, not anger, just a slight tightening at the corners of her eyes. I appreciate the information, she said, in a tone that made clear she did not particularly appreciate it. About the wagon? 2 doors down, he said again. She went. He watched her walk away, and he didn't feel good about the conversation, which was irritating because he'd been doing her a favor. Tuts. Manny Pruitt charged her a fair rate for the wagon and sent his youngest son to drive it, which was not a kindness Gideon would have predicted from Manny, who generally held newcomers in suspicion until they'd survived at least 1 full winter. But apparently something about Eliza Rowan's manner of asking had made Manny decide she was worth the trouble. Gideon collected his pump part and drove his own wagon home. He didn't think about her again, or he tried not to. What kept nagging at him was the glove. She'd been wearing a glove on her left hand, leather, tight-fitting, not particularly warm, and she hadn't taken it off when she removed the right one. He'd noticed the way her fingers moved inside it, careful and deliberate. An old injury, maybe. Or a habit. It didn't matter. He had a pump to fix and a herd to move before the first frost. He was 3 miles out of town before he admitted to himself that he'd been watching her hands almost as much as her face. That was strange. He hadn't watched a woman that closely since before. He pushed the thought down where it lived, in the same place where he kept his wife's name and the sound of her laugh and the particular way she'd knocked on wood before saying anything hopeful. Martha had done that. Knocked on wood every time. Don't tempt fate, Gid. Just don't. He hadn't thought about Martha's laugh in a long time. He focused on the road. Quote, the Rowan property sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines, cut through by the remnant of what had been a decent creek before a flood 6 years ago had rerouted it 30 yards to the east. The land itself was not bad land. It had been decent grazing ground once, and the soil in the lower field was rich enough that Silas had managed a kitchen garden even in dry years. But it had been left to itself for 18 months since Silas's death, and neglect in Wyoming moved faster than neglect in most places. Eliza knew this before she arrived. She'd spent the weeks after receiving the deed reading every agricultural pamphlet she could find and writing letters to 2 different land agents who'd operated in Laramie County. She had not told anyone in Coldwater Flats that she'd done this. She had learned, over 29 years, that there was no advantage in letting people know how much you'd prepared. It gave them nothing to underestimate, and she needed that. She needed them to think she was just a school teacher with clean boots and bad judgment. It meant they'd leave her alone while she worked. The cabin was worse than the letters had described. The roof on the east side had 3 separate gaps where light came through, and the porch step had rotted through completely, so she stepped over it. The fireplace needed repointing. The windows were intact, which was something. The well was in better shape than she'd feared. The casing was solid, the water clear. The barn was, well. Gideon Hale had not been wrong about the posts. 2 of the 4 supporting beams on the south wall had rotted at the base, and the structure leaned slightly to the left when she pushed against it with her palm. The stall doors were off their hinges. The tack room roof had partially collapsed onto what remained of a saddle. Manny Pruitt's son, his name was Cal, he was about 16, and he clearly felt that driving a wagon for a city woman was below his dignity, but had been instructed to be polite. Helped her unload her trunks, and left with what she'd agreed to pay him, plus an extra quarter for the trouble. He seemed mildly startled by the quarter. She'd noticed he'd helped her carry the heavier trunk without being asked to, so it was a fair wage. When he was gone, she stood in the middle of the cabin and was very quiet for a while. She let herself have 3 minutes of complete honesty. The cabin was cold. It smelled of damp and old wood smoke, and something beneath that, something like the particular loneliness of a place that has been empty too long, where the air has stopped expecting anyone. The wind came in through the roof gaps like it already owned the place. Her hands hurt, because they always hurt in cold weather since the fire, and the leather of the left glove had worn a new pressure point somewhere near the edge of the scar. 3 minutes. Then she opened her satchel, found the notebook she'd carried from Philadelphia, and started a list. Roof. East side. Priority. South barn wall. Can it be reinforced without replacement? Fireplace mortar. Porch step. Stall doors. Tack room. Assess. Fencing. North pasture. Walk the full line. Well. Water quality. Depth. Soil. Lower field. Test before spring. She wrote until the light started going, then built a fire from wood that Silas had left stacked against the side of the cabin. Dry enough, thank God. And ate cold food from what she'd brought in her bag, because there was no point in cooking properly tonight. She did not cry. She had not cried since the fire, which was 5 years ago now, and she had made a decision somewhere in those 5 years that crying was a thing she would do privately or not at all. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because it cost her something she couldn't always afford to spend. She slept on the floor on her bedroll because the mattress on the cabin's one bed had mold on the east-facing side, and she was not yet desperate enough to sleep on mold. She woke before dawn to the sound of wind and the distant bark of a dog, and she lay there for exactly 2 minutes listening to the difference between the silence here and the silence in Philadelphia, which were very different silences, and then she got up and started the day. Gideon saw the smoke from her chimney on the third morning and surprised himself by feeling relieved. He'd told himself he wasn't watching. He hadn't been watching, exactly. It was just that his barn faced south and the Rowan property was directly in that line of sight when he was doing morning chores. And if a woman had frozen to death in an unheated cabin 2 days after arriving, he'd have noticed eventually. Better to notice sooner. That was practical, not personal. The smoke was thin but steady, which meant she'd learned to bank the fire overnight. That was something. He was mucking out the third stall before he admitted he'd been looking for it. He put down the pitchfork and went to check on his horses instead, which was what he'd meant to be doing in the first place. She came to him 4 days after arriving, which was not what he expected. He was working on the pump mechanism in the side yard. His land, his problem, his knuckles scraped on something that shouldn't have required as much force as it was currently requiring, when he heard boots on gravel and looked up. Eliza Rowan was standing at the edge of his yard wearing work clothes that were already showing 2 days of real labor. The coat traded for a heavier canvas jacket, the hat traded for something more practical, mud on the boots that would have horrified whoever had sold them to her. She was carrying a folded piece of paper. "Mr. Hale," she said. He straightened, wiped his hands on a rag that didn't help much. "Miss Rowan." She held out the paper. "I found this in my uncle's papers. It's a survey from 1871 that describes the original course of the creek." He took it, unfolded it. It was a rough but accurate-looking hand-drawn survey, with the creek shown about where it had been before the flood, running through what was currently the shared property line between his land and hers, then curving east into the Rowan property before joining the main tributary below the ridge. "I know about the survey," he said. "Then you know the water rights documentation from 1874 references that survey, which means when the creek shifted, the water rights question became legally ambiguous." She said it evenly, not aggressively, just as a fact. He looked at her. "I'm aware. I'm not here to fight about the water," she said. "I'm here because I think there's a practical solution, and fighting about it would waste time that neither of us has before winter." She pulled her left hand into the sleeve of her jacket slightly. A habitual movement, he noticed, not a nervous one, like tucking something away. "The creek still runs close enough to the original line that a secondary channel isn't impossible. If we were willing to share labor on digging it, we'd both have reliable water access through the dry months." He stared at her. He had been bracing for a fight about those water rights for 18 months, since Silas died and the land was in probate, and he didn't know who'd inherit it. He had a very good lawyer's letter drafted and ready to send, and a considerable amount of tension stored in his shoulders regarding the subject. She was suggesting they solve the problem with a shovel. "That's a significant amount of digging," he said. "I know. I'm not asking you to do it alone. I'm saying I'd work equal shares and we'd split the benefit." She met his eyes. I'm not fragile, Mr. Hale. Whatever impression I gave you in town, I needed a day or two to get the measure of the land. I have it now. He folded the survey and held it out to her. Where'd you learn about water rights law? Philadelphia has a very good public library. Her mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, more like the precursor to one that she'd decided against. And I had a great deal of time this winter to prepare. He looked at her for a long moment. The pump behind him was still broken. His knuckles were still scraped. There was a frost warning for tonight, and 37 other things requiring his attention. Let me look at the terrain between here and the creek, he said. If the grade works, we can talk. Thank you. She said it simply, without the particular flavor of gratitude that expected something more in return. Just acknowledgement. She turned and walked back the way she'd come. He watched her go, then looked down at his hands, then back at the pump. He had not expected that conversation. The grade worked. He told her so 2 days later when he rode the fence line between the two properties and walked the low ground down to where the creek now ran. It was possible, not easy, but possible, to cut a secondary channel that would split off from the main creek and run parallel to the original course back toward both properties. It would take 3 weeks of serious work and require cribbing in at least 2 places where the soil was loose. He told her all of this standing at the edge of the Rowan property, with the mountains showing the first serious snow on their tops, and the sky doing the particular thing it did in late September in Wyoming, where the blue went so deep and so cold it looked like something behind glass. Eliza listened without interrupting, which was not a thing most people managed. When he finished, she said, "The cribbing? Timber from the barn?" "Some of it. You'd lose 2 of those rotted posts anyway. Might as well make them useful. And if we do it in sections, start at the creek and work back, we can see how the soil behaves before we commit to the full length." "That's what I'd do," he said, slightly surprised. "Then let's start Saturday," she said. "I'll have the tools ready." He'd agreed before he'd thought about it, which was the second time that week she'd gotten him to agree to something before he'd properly decided. He rode home with the irritating suspicion that Eliza Rowan was considerably more prepared for Wyoming than Wyoming was prepared for her. Bummed. Saturday came cold and gray, with a wind off the ridge that had teeth in it. Gideon arrived at the creek with 2 shovels, a pickaxe, and low expectations for how useful a Philadelphia schoolteacher would actually be once the work got difficult. She was already there. Not only already there, but had marked the first section of the proposed channel with stakes, which she'd driven into the ground at measured intervals. The measuring tool she was using was a knotted rope, a simple surveying trick that anyone who'd read the right books would know, and that he had not expected her to know. "You've done survey work," he said, and didn't frame it as a question. "I helped my uncle map a property dispute in Pennsylvania when I was 17, she said. "Different country, same principle." She handed him a shovel. "Shall we start at the creek end or the property end?" They started at the creek end. He told himself he was watching her work to calculate how long the job would actually take when you factored in her likely limits. He was being realistic. He was planning. She worked steadily and without complaint, taking breaks when the work required a break, and not when it required anything else. She moved dirt the way someone moved dirt who had accepted that the dirt needed to move and had made their peace with the physical cost of making that happen. Her left hand in its glove sometimes slipped on the wet handle, and she'd adjust her grip and keep going. By midday, they'd cleared the first section and laid the initial cribbing timber. "You're not bad at this," Gideon said. She looked up at him. "For a city woman," he added. Something in her expression went still. Not quite offense, but the cousin of offense. The kind of expression someone makes when they've been hearing a particular slight long enough that they've stopped bothering to be surprised by it. "Thank you," she said, in the tone that meant she was choosing not to respond to the part of the sentence that needed responding to. He recognized the tone. Martha had used it on him more than once. He looked away and drove his shovel into the next section of earth. They worked until the light died, which was earlier than either of them wanted. When Gideon straightened and looked at what they'd done, he made a rough calculation. At this pace, and assuming no major obstacles, they'd have the channel finished in 2.5 to 3 weeks. Maybe less if they had 2 full days together. "Same time Thursday?" he said. I'll be here, Eliza said. She gathered her tools and walked back toward her property. He watched until she was out of sight, then stayed another few minutes looking at the marked-out channel running through the failing autumn light, trying to put a name to what he was feeling. He couldn't. He went home. The town had opinions because the town always had opinions. The first one he heard was from Margaret Pruitt, Manny's wife, who ran the quilting circle and had therefore appointed herself the moral weather vane of Coldwater Flats, who mentioned to him at the general store that people had noticed his wagon parked near the Rowan property and were wondering if he was being neighborly or something else. Neighborly, Gideon said. Of course. Margaret had a particular smile for statements she'd decided to believe provisionally. She came to our circle last Tuesday, you know. Asked very politely if she could sit in. Nice enough girl. Sews well, actually. A pause. Quiet. Doesn't talk about herself. Nothing wrong with that. Nobody knows anything about her. Margaret said it without accusation, but with a particular weight that meant she found this both troubling and interesting. She keeps her left hand covered all the time. Even when she was sewing, she managed to work around it. Some of the women think she's hiding something. Gideon picked up the bag of flour he'd come for and handed the price across the counter. Some of the women should mind their business. He said it pleasantly enough that Margaret decided to take it pleasantly, but he saw in her eyes that the statement had been noted and would be mentioned later. He drove home thinking about the glove. He'd been trying not to think about the glove. Whatever was under it was Eliza Rowan's own concern. A person's scars, the kind you could see and the kind you couldn't, were their own until they offered them to you. He knew that better than most. He knew because he had his own. They worked the channel for 2 weeks. Over those 2 weeks, Gideon learned things about Eliza Rowan that changed the shape of the judgment he'd made in the first 5 minutes of knowing her, though he was slow to admit this to himself. She was not a talker. She didn't fill silence the way some people did, anxiously, continuously, as though quiet was a sign something had gone wrong. She talked when she had something to say, and when she didn't, she was simply quiet, and the quiet between them on the workdays became progressively less uncomfortable and then, eventually, not uncomfortable at all. She had a dry sense of humor that emerged sideways when you weren't quite expecting it. On a day when they'd spent 2 hours fighting a section of hardpan that refused to yield, and they'd both sweated through their layers, despite the cold, and bent a tool that wasn't supposed to bend, she'd looked at the ground and said, "I had a student who behaved exactly like this. Refused to absorb anything until you'd spent twice the effort you'd planned, and then suddenly gave way all at once." Gideon had laughed before he'd meant to. Actually laughed. The short, involuntary kind that comes out when something lands before you can prepare for it. She'd looked pleased in a small, private way that she didn't amplify or draw attention to. He noticed that she noticed things. The way the soil changed color when they got near the lower water table. The particular angle of a shadow that told you the light was going faster than it felt. The sound a cribbing post made when it was seated right versus when it was just close. She didn't explain how she knew these things. She just reacted to them, and then when he asked how she'd known, she'd say something like, "The pamphlets," or "One of the letters I received from the land agent described something similar." She'd prepared carefully, thoroughly, with the particular devotion of someone who knew they couldn't afford to fail. He found himself wanting to know why she couldn't afford to fail, what the stakes were, whether the answer had anything to do with the glove. He didn't ask, but he thought about it. 3 Sundays after she'd arrived, Gideon found himself on his back porch in the early evening, watching the light go red on the ridgeline, doing nothing, which was something he almost never did. He had a long list of undone things that could justify activity. He did them instead of sitting here. He was sitting here. What kept moving through his mind, and he didn't want it to, but here it was something Margaret Pruitt had said that he hadn't bothered to respond to, because he didn't give her the satisfaction. She doesn't talk about herself. Neither did Gideon Hale. He'd had a wife and a happy marriage, and then the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself so much as it simply removes all the furniture and closes the door. Martha had died 3 years ago, in February, in an entirely ordinary way that he could not forgive for being so ordinary. She'd been sick for 2 months, and then gone in a night, and he'd been left with 250 acres and a very quiet house, and the particular form of anger that looks like stubbornness from the outside. He hadn't let anyone pass the edge of his property in 3 years. Not really, not past the surface of a conversation. Eliza Rowan hadn't tried to get past the surface. She'd just worked beside him. He didn't know what to do with that. He went inside before full dark and ate dinner and did not think about her. Or he did think about her, but in the way you think about a problem you've set aside, aware of it somewhere in the background, not ready to sit down with it yet. The channel was finished on a Thursday evening in mid-October, just ahead of the first real cold front that came in from the northwest and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 6 hours. They walked the full length of it as the water started moving, following the new track from the creek down through the cribbed sections toward both properties. It worked. Not perfectly. There was one section where it ran shallow over an unexpected shelf of rock, and they'd need to come back in spring and deepen it. But the water moved. It reached the property line and divided, and both of them stood there watching it do the thing water does, which is simply find its way. "That'll hold through winter," Gideon said. "Yes," Eliza agreed. They stood there for a while longer, not because there was anything left to say about the channel, but because neither of them moved to leave. The light was going fast. The front was coming in with a smell like snow that was still 3 or 4 days away, but was already announcing itself. "Your uncle," Gideon said finally. "Was he the one who left you the land?" "He was my mother's brother," she said. "He never had children. He wrote to me twice a year, every year, always about the property. What was growing, what wasn't, what the winter had done." She paused. "He was the only person who wrote to me about ordinary things. Most people only write when something important happens. He wrote about whether the kitchen garden had done well." Gideon thought about that. "Good man," he said. "Like I told you." "Yes." She looked at the water. "I wanted to see what he'd spent his life building. I owed him that." He almost asked about the left hand then. Almost. But she'd turned toward her property and the moment was already passing, and he let it go. "I'll come by Saturday," he said. "Your roof needs attention before that storm." She looked back at him, surprised. "That's not neighborly," he said, before she could say it herself. "That's practical. A neighbor with a collapsing cabin becomes a problem for the county and eventually for me. I'd rather deal with the roof." She held his gaze for a second too long. Then, "I'll have the materials ready." She walked home in the failing light, and Gideon stood where he was until the water moving through the new channel was the only sound left. He picked up his tools. He was in trouble, and he knew it, and he wasn't quite ready to admit the shape of it. He went home in the dark. The roof took the better part of 2 Saturdays to fix properly, because nothing about the Rowan cabin was willing to cooperate with a straightforward repair. Gideon had come the first Saturday with cedar shingles he'd cut from his own surplus stock, and they'd worked from first light until the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and by the end of the day they'd replaced the worst of the east side damage, and discovered that 2 of the underlying boards had rotted through in a way that wasn't visible from below. That meant the second Saturday involved pulling up more than they'd planned and replacing boards that Eliza had to ride into Coldwater Flats to purchase, because Gideon didn't have enough in his lumber stack. She'd gone into town on Friday afternoon, negotiated a fair price from the mill supplier without asking Gideon's advice on what fair was, and had the lumber delivered to her property that evening. He'd found it stacked neatly against the side of the cabin when he arrived the next morning, already sorted by length. He looked at the stack, then at the cabin, then at her, where she was standing on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "You measured the gaps," he said, Thursday evening. She held out one of the cups. "Milk? No sugar? That's what I had." He took the cup. "That's fine." She hadn't asked him how he took his coffee. She'd watched him drink it at the creek over 2 weeks and drawn her own conclusions, which were correct. He noticed this and said nothing about it, but it sat in his chest in a way that was hard to categorize. They worked the second Saturday with the kind of efficiency that only comes from people who've already learned the shape of each other's working rhythm, who moves faster on the setup, who steadies better on the high work, when to hand something across without being asked. Gideon was good on the roof. He didn't love it the way some men did, as a demonstration of their comfort with height, But he was methodical and sure-footed, and he'd done enough of it over the years to move without wasting motion. Eliza worked the lower portion of the slope, passing materials up and managing the tools with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything physical. She had a way of anticipating what came next. He'd reach for a nail, and she'd already have set the bundle within arm's reach. He'd need to shift position, and she'd have moved the rope out of his path before he got there. "You ever worked construction before?" he asked, somewhere around midday. "No," she said. "I taught school for 4 years. You learn to read the room." He thought about that. "That's a stretch." "Is it?" She handed up another board. 32 children in a Philadelphia schoolroom who'd all rather be anywhere else. You learn to see where things are going before they get there, or you lose the whole afternoon. He took the board, settled it, started the first nail. 32. Some years 34. She didn't say it as a complaint, just as a fact that had required a particular response for a particular number of years. He worked a moment in silence. "Why'd you leave?" The question came out more directly than he'd meant it, and he felt the slight awkwardness of it. But Eliza didn't pull back from it. "The school closed," she said. "The board decided the district couldn't support a 4th building. The families were redistributed to the other 3 schools." She paused. "And my uncle had died the previous month, and I had this deed, and it seemed like—" She didn't finish for a moment. "It seemed like a decision was being made for me, and I had the choice of making it myself or just letting it happen. So you came." "So I came." He drove the second nail. "Most people would have sold the deed." "I know," she said. "A man at the land office offered me $200 for it before I'd even gotten on the stagecoach. Said the property wasn't worth more, but he was doing me a kindness." Gideon snorted. "Yes," Eliza said, with the same slight precursor to a smile expression he'd seen before. "My thought as well." What? The storm the front had been promising arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a workday between them, but which brought Gideon to his front window twice an hour anyway, looking south toward the Rowan property. It wasn't a blizzard, not yet, that was coming later in the season, but it was the kind of driving, sideways cold rain that punished any structure with a compromised seal, and the Rowan cabin had been a compromised structure right up until 10 days ago. The roof they'd repaired would hold. He was nearly certain. The fireplace mortar had been repointed. Eliza had done that herself on a day when he wasn't there, and he'd seen it on his next visit and run his thumb along the joints and found them solid. The windows were caulked. The porch step had been replaced with a new board that was noticeably sturdier than anything else on the porch, which he suspected meant she'd selected it specifically. The cabin would hold. He still looked out the window more than was reasonable. On Thursday morning, when the rain had settled to an intermittent drizzle and the temperature was hovering at something just miserable enough to require 2 layers, he rode the fence line between their properties on the pretext of checking the new channel. The channel had a small debris blockage at the cribbed section nearest the creek, leaves and a branch carried by the runoff, and he cleared it, which genuinely needed doing, and then stood there for a while looking at nothing in particular. The smoke from the Rowan chimney was visible above the ridgeline. Steady. The good kind of smoke that meant a banked fire, properly managed. He cleared the second debris point that didn't actually have debris yet, but might develop some. And then he went home. The quilting circle met on the 3rd Tuesday of every month at Margaret Pruitt's house, and Eliza had been attending since her 2nd week in Coldwater Flats. She went because she was a practical person, and a quilting circle in a small frontier town was not a social indulgence, it was a social necessity. It was where information moved, where alliances formed, where the unspoken rules of a community were transmitted through conversation so casual that the rules themselves were almost invisible. You either knew those rules or you made expensive mistakes. She preferred to know them. The women who attended were Margaret Pruitt, who organized everything and knew everyone's business, Clara Henshaw, the doctor's wife, who was sharp and generally fair-minded, 2 Olmsted sisters whose names were both variations of the same name and who finished each other's sentences, Dora Yates, who was largely silent but missed nothing, and a younger woman named June Caldwell, who had married into a neighboring homestead 2 years ago and still had the slightly dazed quality of someone who had not entirely finished adjusting. They were not unfriendly. They were, in the way of small towns, cautious. giving just enough to invite reciprocal disclosure, never enough to feel exposed. Eliza understood this instinctively because she operated the same way, which meant the early sessions had a particular quality of mutual pleasant opacity, like two careful people playing chess without acknowledging they were playing chess. What shifted it was the Olmsted sisters asking, in their overlapping fashion, about the left glove. "We've all noticed," one of them said. Vera, Eliza thought, though she still occasionally confused them. "And we don't mean to pry, we just... Is it cold? Do you need a warmer pair? Clara's husband has medical supplies if there's... It's an old scar," Eliza said. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone has said exactly what everyone wanted to know, but had been dancing around for weeks. "Oh," said the second Olmsted sister. "I keep it covered because..." Eliza stopped. She was going to say because people make it into something larger than it is. But she looked around the table at 7 women who had, between them, survived things she likely couldn't fully imagine, and she chose something more honest instead. "It's easier," she said. "When people see it, they react to it. I'd rather they react to me." The silence had a different quality after that. Dora Yates, who had not spoken in the entire previous hour, looked up from her stitching and said, "That's reasonable." It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was the closest thing to it that Coldwater Flats generally offered on a first approach. June Caldwell leaned slightly in Eliza's direction later in the evening, during the part where they'd stopped pretending the conversation was secondary to the sewing. "People wonder about you and Gideon Hale," she said, in a low tone that was still perfectly audible to at least 3 of the other women. "We have adjoining properties," Eliza said. "We've been doing necessary work." "He hasn't done necessary work with anyone in 3 years," June said, "since his wife died." Eliza absorbed this. She'd known about the wife in the abstract. It was the kind of thing that circulated in a small town, the fact of a death without much of the shape of it. She hadn't known the 3 years. "He's a private person," she said. "He's a closed-off person," Clara Henshaw corrected, not unkindly. "There's a difference. He was different before. Warmer." She paused over her stitching. "He was actually quite funny before. You wouldn't know it now." Eliza wouldn't have described Gideon Hale as funny, exactly, but she thought about the moment at the creek when she'd made the comment about the difficult student and he'd laughed, the short, involuntary kind. And she thought maybe Clara Henshaw was not entirely wrong. She didn't say any of this. She said, "Loss changes people," and moved on, and the circle moved with her. Gideon came to her property on the following Saturday. Not for any scheduled work, but because he'd been at the Henshaw place that morning discussing a land drainage matter with Dr. Henshaw and had passed within a mile of her fence line and told himself he might as well check the channel. The channel was fine. The channel didn't need checking. He was tying his horse to her fence post when she appeared from around the south side of the barn carrying a pry bar, her hair less neatly pinned than usual because she'd clearly been working at something that involved effort. "Mr. Hale," she said, with the slight arch of someone who suspected the channel was a pretext but was willing to let it pass. "Miss Rowan." He looked at the pry bar. "The barn posts? I've been trying to assess whether they can be reinforced without full replacement. I think the answer is no, at least for the worst one." She glanced toward the barn. "I'll need to replace it before serious snowfall." "You can't do that alone." "I know." She said it without either resentment or resignation, just as a statement of physical reality. "I was going to ask if you knew anyone in town who might be available for hire." He thought. "Tom Beale does that kind of work. He's reliable, not cheap." "I expected not cheap." She set the pry bar against the fence. "Would you be willing to tell me what a fair rate is? I don't want to negotiate from ignorance." He told her. She thanked him without making it into more than it was. He stayed anyway. He wasn't sure why exactly, except that the day was clear and cold, and her company had become a thing he didn't find unpleasant, and that was rare enough in his current life that he noticed it. They ended up in the small kitchen of the cabin because Eliza had coffee on the stove and offered it, and refusing would have required a reason, and he didn't have one that wouldn't have sounded deliberate. The kitchen was not what he'd expected. It was not the kitchen of a woman who was enduring a frontier life she hadn't wanted, It was the kitchen of someone who had made considered choices about what to keep and what to let go. There were books on the shelf beside the window. He could see the spines from where he sat. A mix of agricultural manuals and things with titles that suggested novels. There were dried herbs hanging near the stove, which meant she'd either ordered them or found them wild. The table had a small oil lamp on it with a good quality glass globe. She'd brought things, specific things, chosen on purpose. "You plan to stay," he said, looking at the lamp. She set down his cup. "I always planned to stay. I wouldn't have come if I hadn't." "Most people in your position would have—" "I know what most people would have done," she said, without sharpness, but with a clarity that suggested she'd made this decision in the full awareness of what most people would have done and had chosen differently. "I'm not most people." He looked at her across the table. There was a quality in the silence that had started showing up in the last couple of weeks. A particular kind of charge that wasn't uncomfortable but wasn't entirely neutral either. He recognized it the way you recognize something you've felt before and have good reason to approach carefully. He picked up his coffee. "How long were you a teacher?" he asked. 4 years. I started when I was 24. She wrapped both hands around her cup, the left one with the glove, the right one bare, pale-knuckled with cold. "I liked it. I was good at it. But," she considered, "but it wasn't what I'd meant to do with my life. I'd meant to—" She stopped, started again. "I had plans that didn't work out. Teaching was what came after." He waited to see if she'd say what the plans had been. She didn't. He didn't push. He understood, more than most, what it meant to build a different life on top of the one you'd lost. "I was going to be married," he said, and didn't know why he said it except that the conversation had a gravity to it that seemed to require something equal. "Martha, she grew up in Cheyenne, she wasn't from the frontier either. Her family thought she was making a mistake." He looked at the window. They weren't wrong about the difficulty. They were wrong about the mistake. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "How long were you married?" 7 years. And she died 3 years ago. He looked at her. "Clara Henshaw." "The quilting circle," she said, with a slight dip of her head that was almost an apology, but not quite. "I didn't ask. It came up." He supposed it did, in a town this size. He found, to his mild surprise, that he didn't particularly mind. "February," he said. "She was sick 2 months and then gone. It was ordinary, in a way that made it harder somehow. There was nothing dramatic about it to be angry at." Eliza looked at her cup. "I know something about that," she said quietly, "when grief doesn't have an obvious target." He wanted to ask what she meant. He didn't. "I should get back," he said instead. She walked him to the door, which was a normal thing to do, and he put on his coat, which was a normal thing to do, and the normalcy of all of it was sitting on top of something that was not particularly normal at all, and he was choosing, deliberately, not to look at it directly. "Saturday," he said. "I'll talk to Tom Beale about the barn post." "I appreciate it," she said. He rode home in the clear, cold afternoon and thought about the lamp on her table, which she had carried all the way from Philadelphia because she'd planned to stay. Tom Beale came out the following week with a helper and replaced both of the rotted barn posts in a single long day. Gideon had come to oversee. His word, to himself, though supervised would have been more honest, and making sure it was done right, more honest than that. He and Tom had an easy working relationship built on a decade of occasional mutual assistance, and Tom was skilled enough that oversight wasn't really what Gideon was providing. What he was actually providing was a presence that seemed to make Eliza's dealings with Tom and his helper slightly more straightforward. Not because she needed protection from Tom, who was a decent man, but because Coldwater Flats operated on a system of vouching, where a known quantity standing near an unknown quantity transferred some measure of social credibility, and Gideon's presence communicated that Eliza Rowan had someone willing to stand near her, which in the currency of small frontier towns was worth something real. He understood this without articulating it. He suspected Eliza understood it too, and had chosen not to mention it, for the same reason she hadn't mentioned a lot of things. Tom did good work. The new posts were solid, the barn walls straightened as the structure resettled, and by the end of the day, the south wall was plumb for the first time in what looked like at least 2 years. Tom charged her a fair rate. Gideon had made sure of this in advance without telling Eliza he'd made sure of it, which he felt mildly conflicted about, because she would not have appreciated the intervention. But Tom's initial estimate had been 20% too high, and Gideon wasn't willing to let that stand. After Tom left, Eliza walked the barn and checked the posts and the realigned walls with the serious attention of someone who intended to maintain what she'd just paid for. "It's good work," she said. "Tom knows what he's doing." She turned from the wall. "Did you talk to him about the price before today?" He held her gaze. "I mentioned that I'd seen your assessment of the damage and thought his estimate was high." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something moving behind her eyes. Not anger, not quite, but the close cousin of it. "I can negotiate my own arrangements, Mr. Hale," she said. "I know," he said. "But Tom's first number with a newcomer is usually 20% higher than his second number, and you shouldn't have to pay for the education." "What I should or shouldn't have to pay for isn't—" She stopped, took a breath. "You should have told me. Before." "You're right," he said. That appeared to surprise her. She'd been preparing for an argument and he hadn't given her one, and she recalibrated visibly. "I would have handled it," she said, quieter now. "I believe that," he said. "It wasn't a question of whether you could handle it. I just—" He stopped, because the rest of the sentence was, "I didn't want you to have to," and he recognized that as something he had no standing to say. "I'll let you handle it next time," he said instead. She studied him for a moment. "All right," she said. It was an absolution, but it was acceptance. And he took it. One. November arrived with the particular decisiveness that Wyoming Novembers had. Not a gradual cooling, but a renegotiation of terms, where the land made clear that the previous season's arrangements were concluded and new ones were now in effect. The temperature dropped below freezing at night and didn't fully recover during the day. The creek ran slower and showed ice at the edges each morning. The sky did the November thing where the clouds stayed low and close, pressing down like a lid. Eliza had put up her garden stores weeks ago. A smaller kitchen garden than she'd hoped for, given the late start, but enough. She'd traded 3 jars of preserves to Margaret Pruitt for dried beans, which was a transaction that had the secondary purpose of establishing her as someone who had something worth trading, which mattered going into winter. She'd taken stock of her firewood twice, and both times concluded she needed more, and had spent the last week of October adding to the pile against the cabin's north wall until her hands ached constantly, and the scar pulled every time she gripped the axe too hard. She didn't stop. She had learned at 24, in the aftermath of the fire and everything the fire had taken, that stopping was the more dangerous option. Not stopping was painful. Stopping let in the other things. She thought about the fire less often than she had in the first years. It had stopped being the first thing she remembered in the morning and had become instead something she carried the way you carry an old injury, aware of it when the weather changed, when she was tired, when something brushed the scar at the wrong angle. Thomas had been dead for 5 years. She'd been grieving him for 5 years in the particular private way she did things, without putting it on display, without asking for accommodation. She did not think she was over it. She was not sure that was something you got over. But she had built a life around the shape of the absence, the way a tree grows around a fence post, and most days the life was what she noticed, not the absence. Gideon came on a Thursday evening in early November, which was unusual. Their working days had settled into Saturdays and occasionally Sundays, and a Thursday visit with no prior arrangement meant something had come up. She saw him coming from the window and met him at the door before he knocked. "The channel," he said. "Ice is damming up at the second crib. If it backs up tonight and then freezes hard, we'll lose the cribbing." She already had her coat and gloves. "I know. I was watching it this afternoon. I was going to ride over to your place if you hadn't come." He looked at her for half a second in a way she couldn't quite read. "Have you got a lamp?" "Already lit." They rode out together in the descending dark, which was not romantic in any way that Eliza was prepared to consider, because it was cold enough that thinking about anything except the work was a luxury neither of them could afford. The ice dam at the second crib was real and had been building all afternoon. A shelf of thin ice had formed across the channel at a slight narrowing, and behind it the water was backing up and starting to spill its banks. They broke it with poles in the dark and the cold, working fast, the lamp giving just enough light to see what needed breaking. The ice came up in sheets and had to be pulled clear of the channel so it didn't reform downstream. Eliza's left glove was soaked through within 20 minutes, and the cold on the scar made her hand clumsy, and she switched to holding the pole one-handed for a while before she got feeling back. Gideon didn't comment on this. He just worked around it, taking the heavier braking work without making it into something she needed to acknowledge. After an hour, the channel was running clear, and they'd salted the crib edges with what Gideon had brought in a bag across his saddle. It would help for a few days. They'd need to check it again after the next hard freeze. They stood at the channel's edge with their breath coming in visible puffs and the lamp burning low between them. "We'll have to do this every week," he said. "I know." She flexed her left hand. The feeling was coming back, which was always slightly worse than the numbness. "I'm going to build a deflector upstream. It'll break the surface ice before it reaches the crib." He looked at her. "Where'd you read about that?" "I didn't," she said. "I watched the water all afternoon, and I think it's what would work." She paused. "Tell me if I'm wrong." He thought about it. "You're not wrong. I would have done it differently, but your way's simpler." She looked at him. "How would you have done it?" He told her. She considered it. "That's better for high water. Mine's better for ice." "Fair enough," he said. They started back toward the horses. The dark was complete now, the lamp the only light besides the stars, and the cold had the quality of something with weight to it, pressing close. Eliza's hand had stopped hurting and gone back to the dull awareness that was its winter baseline. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I told you," he said. "Practical. Your channel problem is my channel problem." "I know what you told me." She said it evenly, without challenge, just noting the distinction between what he'd said and what she meant. "Thank you anyway." He was quiet for a moment. In the dark, without the usual visual cues, his voice had a quality she hadn't noticed in daylight, lower, less guarded. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You've mentioned something similar before. I'm saying it more directly now." She looked sideways at him, though there wasn't much to see. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd give up," he said. "Someone who'd try hard for 2 weeks and then find a reason. A good enough reason. The roof, the channel, the barn, the winter. Any one of them would have been enough." "I told you I planned to stay," she said. "People say that." "I know." She thought for a moment. "I came here because I needed to build something that was mine. Not earned through someone else's credit or supported by someone else's decision. I needed to see what I could make from the beginning." She paused. "After a while, you need to find out what you're actually capable of, without assistance." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond. "Yeah," he said finally. "I understand that." They rode back to the property line in the cold and the dark, and Gideon waited until she had her horse stabled and the barn door secured before he turned toward his own land. She stood at the barn door and watched him go until the dark took him. The lamp burned down to almost nothing in her hand. She went inside and rebuilt the fire and sat beside it with her left hand open toward the heat, and she thought about what he'd said. "You're not what I expected." And the way it had landed, not as a compliment exactly, but as something more valuable than a compliment, as a recalibration, as an admission. She thought about what Clara Henshaw had said about him being warmer before. She thought she could see it if she looked from the right angle. Something underneath the terseness, underneath the practical framing of every conversation. Something that had not entirely closed. She told herself not to think about it. She thought about it anyway. The fire burned down and the wind pressed at the roof they'd fixed together, and it held, which she had known it would. And she sat in her cabin on the Wyoming frontier in November with her list of still undone things and her stored preserves and her dried herbs and the lamp she'd carried from Philadelphia. And she was not happy exactly, but she was something she'd almost stopped believing she could be. She was somewhere she'd chosen. The deflector Eliza had described worked better than either of them had expected, which was satisfying in the way that things you build with your own hands and your own reasoning are satisfying. Not triumphant, just solid. She'd constructed it from split timber angled upstream of the second crib, driving the posts herself on a Monday morning when Gideon wasn't there, and when he came by Thursday and saw it standing in the channel, the water breaking cleanly around it without accumulating on the crib face, He stood there for a moment without saying anything. "It's holding," she said from behind him. "I can see that." "You thought it wouldn't." "I thought it might not." He turned. "There's a difference." She allowed this distinction without comment, but something in her expression said she'd noted it. They'd fallen into a rhythm by November's second week that neither of them had designed and neither had named. Gideon came on Saturdays and often Thursdays. Eliza came to his property on Tuesdays when she had a question about the land that required seeing his terrain to answer it, which happened more often than coincidence could account for, though she always arrived with a genuine question and he always had a genuine answer. They shared coffee or they didn't, they worked or they assessed. Sometimes they sat at her kitchen table with the lamp between them and talked about the land in the way that people who care about land talk about it, not as property, but as a system with its own logic that you could learn to read if you paid attention long enough. Gideon found himself paying attention to things he hadn't paid attention to in years, not just the land. The way she held a thought when she was uncertain about it, turning it over before she spoke. The way she moved through her own cabin, not like a guest who hadn't fully arrived, but like someone who had already begun to belong to the place. The fact that she'd started leaving her agricultural manuals open on the table at whatever page she was currently working through, which meant she was no longer treating his visits as occasions requiring tidiness. He noticed all of this. He was careful about what he did with the noticing. The town, meanwhile, had begun to settle into an opinion about the two of them, which was inevitable, and which Gideon chose not to address directly, because addressing it directly would give it more weight than ignoring it. Margaret Pruitt had said something to him at the feed store about how nice it was that he was being helpful to the Rowan woman, with a particular inflection on helpful that was meant to invite response. He'd said the channel was a shared concern, and left it there. Eliza, he suspected, was handling similar conversations at the quilting circle with similar economy. She had the particular skill of deflecting personal questions by answering a slightly different question than the one asked, not lying, just redirecting. And he imagined she deployed it regularly among the women who had been cataloging her behavior since she'd arrived. What he hadn't anticipated was the conversation with Walt Greer. Walt Greer owned the largest cattle operation in Laramie County, a fact he conveyed in every interaction through a combination of physical presence and conversational dominance that stopped just short of explicit statement. He was 53, built like a man who had worked hard in his 30s and was now coasting on the result, with the kind of easy authority that came from never having had it genuinely challenged. He and Gideon had an arm's-length relationship built on adjacent land interests and mutual wariness. Gideon respected his operational knowledge and disliked his manner, and he suspected Walt felt something similar in reverse. Walt came to Gideon's property on a Wednesday morning in mid-November, which was not usual. He came on horseback, which was Walt's preferred mode for conversations he wanted to control, because it kept him at height advantage over anyone on foot. Gideon was splitting wood when he arrived and did not stop splitting wood, which was his preferred response to Walt's preferred method. "Hail," Walt said. "Greer." Gideon set another log. "What can I do for you?" Walt looked at the woodpile with the assessing expression of a man calculating resources that weren't his. "Heard you've been spending considerable time at the Rowan place." "I've been doing some necessary work on shared infrastructure." Gideon split the log. "Water channel, roof, the usual things neighbors do." Walt shifted in his saddle. "Thing is, I've had some interest in that property. Had interest before the old man died, actually. Made him a fair offer and he turned it down, which was his right. Now it's passed to the niece, and I thought, given that she's new to the country, might be looking to liquidate once she sees what she's up against. I might approach her again." Gideon set another log and didn't immediately speak. "The thing is," Walt continued, in the tone of someone explaining something simple to someone who required explanation, "I'd rather know before I ride out there whether she's actually serious about staying or whether she's going to come around to the practical decision eventually. Saves everyone time." "I can't tell you that," Gideon said. "Can't or won't?" "Both." Gideon drove the axe. "That's her decision, Greer. You can ask her yourself." Walt was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the easy tone had shifted slightly. Not threatening, just cleaner of its friendliness. "She's not going to make it through a full season. You know that. The ranch has been failing for 6 years, and a school teacher from Philadelphia isn't going to reverse that. A pause. I'll offer her a fair price, more than fair. She'll come out ahead. She plans to stay, Gideon said. You know that for certain. She told me herself. He set the axe. And I've watched her work for 6 weeks. I wouldn't bet against her if I were you. Walt looked at him for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating something. You're sure about this? I'm sure about what I've seen, Gideon said. What you do with that is your business. Walt left. Gideon stood with the axe in his hand and looked at the space where Walt's horse had been and felt a cold that wasn't entirely from the November air. Walt Greer did not take no as a conclusion. He took it as an opening position. He would go to Eliza directly and he would be charming about it, because Walt was always charming when he needed something, and he would present his offer as the sensible option and her plans as the romantic ones. He told himself it was her right to handle it however she chose. He rode over that afternoon anyway. She was in the barn when he arrived, doing something with the mare she'd acquired the previous week. A dark bay with a nervous temperament and a tendency to bite, which Eliza had purchased from a family leaving the county at a price that suggested she'd negotiated well, and the family had been desperate. The horse was sidling away from whatever Eliza was attempting, and Eliza was holding her position with the particular patience of someone who has decided that patience is not a feeling but a tactic. She bite you yet? Gideon asked from the barn door. Once, Eliza said, not looking away from the horse. I don't think she meant it personally. She made a small movement with her hand, not reaching forward, just present, and the mare's ear rotated toward her, not entirely hostile. She's scared, not mean. There's a difference. He thought again about how she said things that had 2 layers to them without seeming to intend it. He told her about Walt Greer. She listened without interrupting, her attention still partly on the horse, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment that he couldn't read. What's the property worth? She said finally. To Greer? Everything between his north range and the county road. He's been trying to assemble that corridor for 10 years. Your land is the last piece. What's it actually worth? Market. He told her his honest estimate. She nodded slowly. And what will he offer? Higher than that, likely. High enough to feel like a decision point. She finally looked at him. You think I'll take it? I think it will be presented very attractively, he said carefully. Something in her expression went still. In the particular way it went still when she was choosing not to respond to the part of a statement that needed responding to. He recognized the expression. He'd caused it before. He recognized that he was doing it again, framing her choice as a question of capability rather than preference. And he stopped. You told him I planned to stay, she said. I did. Thank you for that. She turned back to the mare. When he comes, I'll handle it. I know you will. But thank you, she said, for telling me in advance. He acknowledged this and left, and he told himself he hadn't gone over there to warn her so much as to give her information she needed, which was true, but not complete. Walt Greer came on a Friday, which Eliza had expected because Friday was the day men like Walt preferred for business calls. Close enough to the weekend to imply leisure, far enough from Monday to imply patience. She'd been told he was a man who liked height advantage, so she'd been doing work on the barn roof when he arrived, and she watched him ride up from 12 feet above and noted the slight adjustment in his expression when he found her above him rather than below. She climbed down. He was charming. He was very good at it, actually. The particular charm of a man who had been practicing for 30 years, warm without being familiar, confident without being loud. He said nice things about her uncle, appropriate things about how difficult it must be to take on an inherited property without prior experience, admiring things about the work she'd clearly already done. Then he made his offer. It was, as Gideon had said, higher than market. High enough that she had to hold herself still inside to keep from showing that it was higher than she'd expected. She waited until he'd finished. Mr. Greer, she said, I appreciate you coming in person. That's considerate. She folded her hands, the left one gloved, the right one bare, a visual contrast she no longer noticed consciously, and met his eyes. I'm not selling. He didn't miss a beat. Miss Rowan, I understand the attachment to your uncle's memory. It's not about my uncle's memory, she said. I came here to build something. I'm building it. The offer is generous, and I'm declining it. A slight shift in his expression, the charm becoming a fraction more deliberate. You've had a mild autumn. A real Wyoming winter is different. I've seen experienced homesteaders make the decision to sell in February that they couldn't imagine making in October. I'm sure that's true, she said. It won't be me. How can you be certain? Because I've thought about it more carefully than most people think to, she said. And because I'm familiar with the specific kind of conversation where someone describes my limitations to me in a helpful tone, and I've learned that the people having that conversation are generally more interested in my compliance than my welfare. Walt Greer looked at her for a long moment. The charm was still there, but underneath it something had reassessed her. If you change your mind, he began. I'll let you know, she said. Thank you for the visit. He left. She stood in the yard after he'd gone and took a long breath and let the tension out of her shoulders, which had been very carefully held in place during the entire conversation. Her left hand ached inside the glove. The cold was coming in harder this week, and the scar tightened in the cold in a way that never entirely stopped being inconvenient. She went back up to the barn roof. She told Gideon about it on Saturday, briefly and without drama, and watched his face as she recounted what she'd said to Walt Greer about the specific kind of conversation she recognized. His expression did something complicated. What? She asked. Nothing, he said. You're thinking something. He looked at her steadily. I'm thinking that I had a version of that conversation with you the day you got off the stagecoach, he said. The one about winter not making exceptions. She held his gaze. Yes, I wasn't wrong about the winter. No, she agreed. You weren't. Neither of them said the other part of it, that he'd been wrong about her, in the same way Walt Greer had been wrong about her, with the same architecture of assumption. He knew it. She knew he knew it. The silence held it between them without requiring them to put words to it. Fair enough, he said finally. She handed him a tool. They went back to work. The first real blizzard arrived on the 3rd of December, 2 weeks earlier than the longtime county resident said was typical, and 3 weeks earlier than any almanac Eliza had consulted had suggested. It came overnight. She went to bed with snow flurrying and a wind that was steady, but not alarming, and woke at 3 a.m. to a sound that was not wind so much as a sustained assault, a white noise of immense physical force that had been filling the world while she slept. She lay still for a moment, taking it in, then got up and checked the fireplace and built it up, and then stood at the window and could not see anything at all except white moving through white. She was not afraid exactly, but she was honest about what she was looking at. The cabin held. The new roof held. The fireplace drew cleanly. She had 10 days of wood inside and another 2 weeks' worth on the covered stack against the north wall, close enough to retrieve without going far into the storm. She had food, lamp oil, water from the barrel she'd started keeping inside when the temperature dropped. She had prepared. She had prepared for this specifically. What she hadn't prepared for was the mare. She realized it at 5 a.m, when the initial inventory of her situation was complete and she was running through the livestock check in her mind. The mare was in the barn. The barn was solid now. Tom Beale's posts, the repaired south wall, the roof she and Gideon had fixed in October. But the mare was nervous in the best of conditions, and the sound this storm was making was not the best of conditions. And a panicked horse in a barn alone could injure itself badly against its own stall in a way that happened fast and got worse faster. She dressed in every layer she had available, 2 pairs of socks, her heaviest coat over 2 others, the left glove, and then a larger wool mitten over it, which was clumsy but necessary. She wrapped a scarf around the lower half of her face and found the rope she'd read about, the one experienced hands tied from cabin to barn so that you could follow it back if the whiteout disoriented you. And she found the anchor point on the porch post that she'd put there in October for exactly this contingency, and she opened the door into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall with opinions. She kept one hand on the rope and moved. The 20 yards from the cabin to the barn was the longest 20 yards she'd walked since the corridor outside the boarding house where the fire had started, with smoke instead of snow and heat instead of cold, but the same essential quality of moving through a world that was actively trying to stop you. She didn't think about the fire. She thought about the rope in her hand and the next step and the one after. The barn door fought her on the latch. The wind wanted it open or shut and had no interest in the middle position required to slide the bar. She fought it for long enough that her arms were shaking before she got it latched behind her. Inside was better. Dark, the sound reduced by the walls to something survivable, the smell of horse and hay and the particular warm animal presence that meant living things were in here and had not yet been frightened into a disaster. She found the lamp she kept hung just inside the door, lit it, and located the mare. The mare was standing at the back of her stall, neck tight, ears hard forward, showing the whites of her eyes in the lamplight. Not panicked, not yet, but very close to the edge of it. "All right," Eliza said, out loud, not to the horse specifically, just acknowledging the situation. She spent the next hour sitting at the entrance to the mare's stall, not reaching in, not approaching, just present, talking occasionally in the even, unvarying tone she'd used in schoolrooms with children who were frightened and didn't know how to say so. About nothing in particular. The storm, the post-repair. What she planned to plant in the spring if the lower field soil tested the way she expected. The sound of her voice, kept steady by conscious effort, doing the work that steadiness does, not solving the problem, but making it smaller. The mare's ears gradually stopped being weapons. At some point, the horse's head dropped slightly. Not sleep, but the posture of something that has decided the threat is not immediate. Eliza stayed where she was. She was still there when the barn door burst open. Gideon came through the door with the look of a man who had been fighting his way through something significant and was prepared to find damage. He had ice in his beard and on the front of his coat, and his hands were the red-white color that came from sustained cold even through gloves. He was carrying his own lamp and what looked like a second length of rope. He stopped when he saw her. She was sitting on a hay bale at the entrance to the mare's stall, her coat still on, gloved hands folded in her lap, the horse standing calm and low-headed 5 feet away. "You're all right," he said. It was not a question, but it had the quality of something that had been a question for a while before the answer arrived. "I'm fine," she said. "I came out for the mare. She was working herself up." He looked at the mare, who regarded him with mild suspicion but did not escalate. "How long have you been out here?" "An hour? Maybe a little more." She stood, which took slightly more effort than she'd have preferred, because sitting still in the cold for an hour had stiffened everything. "I didn't expect you." "I didn't expect me either." He hung his lamp next to hers, bringing the barn from 1 lamp's worth of shadow to 2. "I woke up and the storm was... I couldn't not come." She looked at him. He was not quite meeting her eyes, looking instead at the mare, at the stall, at the parts of the barn that gave him something to assess. "I put a rope from my cabin," she said. "I'd read about it." "I saw it." He looked at her then. "You had it anchored on the porch post." "October," she said, "when I put up the firewood stack." Something moved through his expression. It came and went quickly, but she caught it. Not surprise exactly. More like the look of someone who has been revising an estimate and has just hit the number where the revision stops. "How's the cabin?" he asked. "Holding. The roof is fine." She picked up her lamp. "You should come in. You're half frozen." "I should get back." "You can't ride back in this," she said. "Look at the door." He looked at the barn door where the gap between door and frame showed nothing but white moving fast. She was right, and he knew it, and she could see that he knew it. "The cabin's warmer," she said. "I have food. We waited out." He didn't argue, which itself said something about the quality of the storm. Gideon Hale argued on principle with most suggestions that implied he needed anything. They moved the horses. She had a second horse, a steady older gelding, closer together in the middle stalls where the body heat would accumulate, checked the feed and water, checked the structure once more in the lamplight, and then made their way along the rope back to the cabin. The 20 yards took 4 minutes. Inside was warm and relatively quiet, which felt extraordinary after the barn and even more extraordinary after the 20 yards of outside. Eliza hung her wet things and moved immediately to the stove. Gideon pulled off his coat and gloves and stood close to the fireplace doing the work of returning to a normal temperature, which took a while. She made coffee. The gesture was domestic in a way that would have felt strange 2 months ago and felt, now, simply practical. "Sit down," she said when she turned and found him still standing near the fireplace, somewhat at a loss for what to do with himself in her space. He sat. She set the coffee in front of him and sat across the table with her own. And for a few minutes they were both simply quiet, listening to the storm do what the storm was doing, which was very loud and very white, and very much the point of the entire situation. "How bad is it between here and your place?" she asked. "The drift at the creek crossing is already 3 feet, he said. "My lane's filling. By morning there won't be a lane." She nodded. "We could both be stuck here 2 days. "Probably 2, yes." He looked into his coffee. "I apologize for the imposition." "You rode out in a blizzard to check on me," she said. "That's not an imposition. That's—" She paused. "That's something different." He looked up. The lamplight between them did what lamplight did in small spaces. It reduced the distance, brought the edges in. Outside, the storm said what it was saying without pause. Inside, the silence had that charge again, the one she'd been aware of for weeks, the one she'd been careful not to look at directly. "Gideon," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name without being invited to. He noticed. She saw him notice. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Not tonight, necessarily, but soon." She looked at the table between them. "About the scar." He was still. "Not because you've asked," she said. You haven't, and I—" She made a slight movement with her left hand, a gesture that acknowledged the thing that had been unspoken between them for 2 months. "I've been keeping it separate because that's what I do. But I think I've been keeping too many things separate." "You don't owe me an explanation," he said. His voice was careful in a way that meant he was protecting something. Her or himself. She wasn't sure. "I know I don't," she said. "I want to tell you." A pause. "Not tonight. Tonight is enough." He looked at her for a long moment across the lamp and the coffee cups and the small distance of a table in a cabin in a blizzard. "All right," he said. They ate what she had. Dried meat, bread she'd made 2 days ago, preserved vegetables from the jars she'd stored in September. It was not a good meal, but it was warm, and it was enough, and they ate it at the same table with the storm outside, pressing against every wall of the cabin, as though trying to get at whatever was inside. After, she set up her bedroll near the fire for him, which was the warmer arrangement, and took the bed herself. He didn't argue about the bedroll, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected the performance of protest. He looked at the bedroll, then at her. "Thank you." "It's practical," she said, deliberately. The slight curve at the corner of his mouth was the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen from him. It changed his face entirely, and she had a sudden, clear understanding of what Clara Henshaw had meant. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the storm and to the quiet, particular sounds of another person present in a space that had only held herself since September. The adjustment of the fire, the weight of someone settling, a low sound that might have been him exhaling slowly against the difficulty of being somewhere unfamiliar. Or the relief of it. She couldn't tell. She slept better than she expected. The storm ran 2 full days, as predicted. They managed it the way they managed everything, practically in rotation, without ceremony. They checked the horses twice a day together. They took turns keeping the fire. They ate what there was. They slept when it was dark and worked when it was light, which in a December blizzard was not many hours. They also talked. Not about everything. Not about Thomas, not yet, and not about Martha in any depth. But about other things, real things, the kind of things that surface when there's nowhere to go and nothing to do except be present with another person. He told her about the year before he'd come to Wyoming, when he'd been working his father's land in Missouri and had felt the slowly building certainty that the land was not his, would never be his in the way that mattered, and how leaving had been harder to justify than staying, and had been the right decision regardless. She told him about her first year teaching, when she'd had a student, 8 years old, very small for his age, who couldn't read and who had been carefully concealing this for 3 years, and how she'd taught him to read in 4 months by never once telling him directly what they were doing. "What did you tell him you were doing?" Gideon asked. "Solving a puzzle," she said. "Every day a new piece." He looked at her steadily. "Does that work on adults?" "Sometimes," she said. "It depends on whether they're willing to stop seeing it as a puzzle." He was quiet for a moment. "What happens when they stop?" "Then you can just teach them the thing," she said. The second morning of the storm, she told him about the fire. She didn't plan it. They were sitting with coffee again, the second morning having a different quality from the first, easier, less formal, the strangeness of the situation absorbed into familiarity. And he'd made an observation about her left hand, not directly, not about the scar, just that she favored it in cold weather, and something in her decided the puzzle was finished. She told him about the boarding house in Philadelphia. November, 5 years ago. A fire that started in the laundry room and moved faster than fires were supposed to move, that cut off the stairs before anyone fully understood what was happening. 2 children on the 3rd floor, a brother and sister, 8 and 6, whose room was at the end of the hall on the far side of where the fire had the staircase blocked. She told him how she'd gone up the servant's back stair before it fully caught, because she'd been on that floor an hour before, and she knew those children were there, and she was the only one who knew. She told him about the beam. A support beam on the ceiling of the 3rd floor hallway had caught while she was coming back with the children, and it had come down at an angle, not on her directly, but on the wall beside her, and the burning edge of it had caught her left arm where she was holding the girl, and she'd kept moving because stopping was not an option, and the children were out and she was out, and then she was on the ground outside in November air, with her arm feeling like something that belonged to someone else. She told him about Thomas. Thomas had gone back in for the family on the 2nd floor. He'd gotten them out. The roof had come down on his way. She said all of this at the kitchen table in the cabin in the blizzard, with the fire burning behind her and the lamp between them, and she said it plainly because that was the only way she knew how to say it, without decoration, without the performance of grief, because the grief itself was present without requiring performance. Gideon listened without moving. When she finished, neither of them said anything for a while. The storm outside had not moderated, and the fire needed wood, and none of that had changed. "The scar," he said finally. "It's not just the arm." "No," she said, "but the arm is what you can see." He looked at her left hand on the table, the gloved one, and she watched him look at it with an expression that was not pity. She had spent 5 years being alert to pity, had learned to read its specific frequency instantly. And what she saw instead was something that required more courage to receive than pity did. He reached across the table and set his hand beside hers. Not on it, just beside it. Present. "Thomas sounds like a man worth grieving," he said. It was such a plain sentence. It was exactly the right sentence. She had not known that was what she needed to hear for 5 years, and she felt it arrive somewhere deep and settle. "He was," she said. Outside the blizzard said what it was saying, and the fire burned and the cabin held around them, and Eliza Rowan sat at her table with her left hand beside his right hand and let herself be for one moment in a place where carrying the scar alone was not the only available option. She didn't cry, but it was the closest she'd come in 5 years. The storm broke on this morning of the 3rd day, not gradually but all at once, the way Wyoming storms sometimes ended, as though a door had been shut somewhere upstream of the weather, and the silence that followed was absolute and white and almost shocking after 2 days of continuous noise. Gideon stood at the cabin door and looked out at a landscape that had been reorganized overnight. The drifts had reshaped everything. The fence line was buried to its top rail in places. The woodpile on the north wall had become a smooth white mound with no visible edges, and the lane that led from the property toward the county road had simply ceased to exist as a distinguishable feature of the terrain. The sky above all of it was the particular blue that followed Wyoming storms, so clear and deep it looked manufactured. Eliza came to stand beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. There was nothing that needed saying about what they were looking at. "The channel," she said finally. "I know." He pulled on his coat. "Let's check the horses first." They'd fallen into the plural without discussion at some point during the 2 days. We and let's, and are appearing in conversation without either of them marking the transition. He noticed it as they crossed to the barn on the path they'd kept open during the storm, and he chose not to comment on it, because commenting would make it into something that required addressing, and he was not ready to address it. The horses were fine. Better than fine, actually. The two animals had settled into an arrangement during the storm that had the quality of a concluded negotiation, the mare standing closer to the gelding than she'd have permitted 2 days earlier, the gelding ignoring her with the patient tolerance of a horse who had seen worse. Eliza checked her over first, and the mare permitted this with only minimal opinion, which represented significant progress. "She's better," Eliza said. "Storm horses," Gideon said. "Some of them come through it calmer, like they've decided the world isn't going to end after all, and they can stop preparing for it." Eliza looked at him. Something in her expression said she heard the second meaning, and that she was going to leave it where it was, in the air between them, unexamined. "I'll feed," she said. "You check the channel?" "I'll do both." "I said I'll feed," she said mildly. He went to check the channel. But the channel had held better than he'd expected and worse than he'd hoped, which was Wyoming's standard performance on any given piece of human infrastructure. The deflector had done its job. The second crib was clear and undamaged, but the upstream section nearest the creek had a drift across it that had packed hard enough to constitute a real blockage, and the water behind it was backed up and had found an alternative route through the lower edge of the Rowan Properties east field, cutting a small secondary channel of its own making that would cause problems in spring if it wasn't addressed now. He stood looking at this for a while, calculating. It was fixable. 2 or 3 hours of work to break the drift, restore the proper flow, and tamp down the edges of the improvised channel the water had cut. It would need doing today, before the temperature dropped tonight and locked everything harder. He went back to tell her. She was already at the channel when he returned, having apparently done the same calculation and arrived 3 minutes ahead of him. "The drift packs," she said, not looking up from where she was already assessing the East Field incursion. 3 hours, he said, "if we start now." "I found a second pickaxe in the barn," she said. "It was Silas's." He looked at the pickaxe she'd leaned against the fence post. It was a good one, well worn, the handle replaced at some point with a piece of ash that had been fitted and shaped by someone who knew what they were doing. He thought about Silas Rowan, who had worked this land for 30 years and left it to his niece because he'd seen something in her that warranted the inheritance. He thought Silas had probably been right. "Let's start at the drift," he said. They worked through the morning in the clean, brutal cold that followed the storm. The packed snow over the channel was denser than regular drift. It had the quality of something that had been compressed by its own weight, and the pickaxe work was hard and repetitive and necessary. Eliza worked with the same steady application she brought to everything physical, and he'd long since stopped monitoring for signs of flagging. She would tell him if she needed to stop. She hadn't needed to stop yet. They talked while they worked, which had become their way. Conversation running alongside the labor, neither competing with it nor dependent on it, surfacing when there was something to surface and going quiet when there wasn't. "Walt Greer will come back," Gideon said, when they'd broken through the main mass of the drift and were working the edges. "After the winter. When he sees you made it through." "I know," Eliza said. "He'll have a different argument, something about the practicality of consolidation probably, the economics of scale." "He's not wrong about the economics." She stopped and looked at him. "He's not," Gideon said. "Small, independent operations in this county are harder every year. Greer's size is a genuine advantage in bad years. He's using it as a threat, but the underlying fact is real." "I know it is," she said. "That doesn't mean I'm selling." "No. It means you need to be bigger than you are." He drove the pickaxe into the remaining drift. "Or connected enough that size doesn't matter the same way." She was quiet for a moment, working a section of packed ice at the channel edge. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything specific," he said. "I'm just saying that isolated small operations are what Greer picks off. He's been doing it for 15 years. The ones who've lasted are the ones who figured out how to make themselves less isolated." She looked at the channel between them, the water already moving more freely through the section they'd cleared. "Like a shared water channel." "That's one kind," he said. He drove the pickaxe again and didn't say what other kinds there were, because he was not ready to say that directly yet, and she didn't ask him to, because she was apparently willing to let him get there in his own time, which was something he was still adjusting to. The particular quality of her patience that was not passive but active, a deliberate choice to give space without withdrawing. Martha had had that quality too, in her own way, different style, same fundamental gift. He thought about Martha less often now than he had a month ago. He felt guilty about that for about 30 seconds, and then recognized the guilt for what it was. Not loyalty to Martha, but the old habit of grief that resisted any evidence of its own softening. Martha, he thought, would have had a great deal to say about Eliza Rowan. Most of it positive, delivered in that particular tone she'd had for people she approved of. Dry, affectionate, a little proprietary. She's something, Gid. Don't be an idiot about it. He wasn't going to be an idiot about it. He was going to be careful, which was different. What? They finished the channel work by early afternoon and stood at the creek end looking back at what they'd done, which was a solid piece of work and would hold until spring, when the whole thing needed a deeper assessment anyway. "Come to my place," Gideon said. "For dinner. I'll cook." She looked at him. "You fed me twice in 3 days," he said. "It's a reasonable balance." "You rode out in a blizzard," she said. "I think that squares things." "Come anyway." She came. His property was 15 minutes on horseback through the reorganized post-storm landscape, the trail between them more suggestion than fact under the snow. His cabin was larger than hers. He'd had 7 years to expand it, and Martha had had opinions about space. And it was warm in a way that said the fire had been banked before he'd left and had kept itself going in his absence. He was lucky in that, at least. Eliza stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the interior. He saw it through her eyes for a second. The larger main room, the bookshelves he'd built along the east wall, the stone fireplace with its wide hearth where Martha's rocking chair still sat, which he'd never moved and sometimes sat in himself and sometimes couldn't look at, depending on the day. A house that had been built for 2 people and had been occupied by one for 3 years, which had a particular quality you couldn't quite name but couldn't miss. She didn't comment on the rocking chair. "Sit," he said. "I'll start the stove." She sat at his kitchen table, which was larger than hers, and looked around the room in the particular way she had of taking inventory, not nosily, just noting what was there. He cooked. It had been a long time since he'd cooked for anyone, and he was somewhat out of the habit of adjusting quantities, but he had a venison stew that had been slow in the making for 2 days before the storm and had survived unattended on the back of the stove, and biscuits were simple enough that he hadn't entirely forgotten. "You cook," she said. "Martha didn't like it," he said. "Or she liked eating. She didn't like the cooking part. So I learned." He paused. "She was good at everything that required patience. Cooking required patience in a way that annoyed her specifically." Eliza smiled, a real one. Not the small precursor version. It changed her face the way Gideon's had changed when she'd seen his, and he found himself wanting to see it again. "Silas apparently couldn't boil water without incident," she said. "My mother used to tell the story of coming to visit and finding him eating salt pork cold from the tin because he'd forgotten the pot and burned through the bottom." "That's a skill in its own right," Gideon said. "That's what he said." She looked at the table. "He was a funny man. I didn't know him well, yet he was my mother's family, and my mother's family was scattered. But those letters... He had a way of making ordinary things sound interesting, not because he dressed them up, just because he actually found them interesting." "The kitchen garden," Gideon said. "The kitchen garden." She paused. He'd write 3 paragraphs about whether the tomatoes had done well and what he thought the reason was either way. It was never about the tomatoes. What was it about? She thought for a moment. Paying attention. He wrote like someone who was paying attention to his own life. "I found that. I wanted that." Gideon set the stew between them and sat down across from her. The lamp was going. The fire was going. Outside, the post-storm dark had the quality of something that had been swept clean and left to settle. "I stopped paying attention for a while," he said, "after Martha. The year after. I went through it, the work and the seasons and the decisions, but I wasn't in it." She looked at him. "You come back," he said. "Gradually, I wasn't sure you did for a while, but you do. Yes, she said quietly. You do. They ate in the comfortable silence that had become one of their available modes. Not empty, not charged, just two people sharing a meal in a warm place after a difficult 2 days, which was one of the simpler and better things you could do. Afterward, she helped him clear the table, which he hadn't asked her to do, and they stood at his kitchen counter briefly in the close quarters way that small kitchens produce, both reaching for the same thing at the same moment and stopping. He was aware of her proximity in a way he'd been managing for several weeks. She stepped back. I should get back before it gets later, she said. It's already late. The horses are fed. The cabin's warm. She looked at the window, where the dark was complete, and the temperature outside had dropped to something that made staying not unreasonable. But I need to... I know, he said. He handed her her coat. I'll ride back with you. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't have to, she said. I know I don't, he said. He rode back with her. But December deepened the way December in Wyoming deepened. Incrementally and then suddenly, 1 week of manageable cold giving way to another week that reassessed what manageable meant. The channel needed checking every 4 days. The horses needed more than they'd needed in November. The days were short enough that most useful light was gone by 4 in the afternoon, which compressed everything and made the evening hours long in a way that was either peaceful or difficult, depending on your relationship with your own company. Gideon had improved his relationship with his own company over 3 years of enforced practice. He'd gotten good at the evenings alone, at the particular kind of thinking you do when there's no one to talk to, at the books that lived on his east wall shelf. He'd made a life that worked without requiring another person in it. He noticed now that the evenings felt longer than they used to. He came to Eliza's on a Thursday in the second week of December. No specific reason. The channel fine when he'd checked it that morning. He came anyway. She opened the door and looked at him and didn't ask why he'd come, which was its own kind of statement. They sat at the kitchen table. Walt Greer has been to see 2 of my nearest neighbors, she said. He'd barely taken off his coat. The Caldwells and the Fenner family. He went still. What for? Buying. She folded her hands on the table. The Caldwells are considering. Their winter has been harder than they expected, and June's mother is ill back in Ohio and they want to be closer to family. And Fenner? Fenner said no, but he said no to a number while he was saying no. She met his eyes. Greer is offering a corridor. He wants the Caldwell land, my land, and Fenner's in one transaction if he can manage it. The price he's offering the Caldwells is contingent on getting the others. Gideon sat back. Where'd you hear this? Clara Henshaw. She and June are close. A pause. June's not certain what to do. She's trying to talk her husband towards staying, but the money is real, and her mother is genuinely ill. Greer's timing, Gideon said, with the particular flatness of genuine anger kept controlled. Yes, Eliza said. He knows how to wait for a pressure point. They sat with this for a moment. If the Caldwells sell, Eliza said, my north fence line moves. Greer's cattle would be operating adjacent to my pasture, and he's not a careful man about fence maintenance when it's his cattle versus someone else's spring planting. You could fight that legally? I could spend 3 years fighting it legally and win and be broke. She shook her head. I need another option. He looked at her. What kind of option? She looked back at him. I don't know yet. That's why I'm telling you. Gideon turned the problem the way he turned difficult things, from different angles, looking for where it was actually solid and where it only appeared solid. Greer's play was the corridor. Without the full corridor, the assembled value was less than the sum of the parts. He needed all 3 properties, which meant any one of them holding was a meaningful disruption to his plan. But holding alone was attrition. You could hold a position for a winter and exhaust your resources doing it and end the spring weaker than you'd started. The Fenners, he said. What about them? If Fenner is committed to staying, what? Really committed, not just said no for now. You need to be in communication with him, formally. An agreement documented that you're both operating the adjacent land and have no intention of selling to anyone without right of first offer to each other. Eliza was quiet, considering this. It doesn't stop Greer, she said. No, but it changes his calculation. Right now he's picking at 3 separate targets. An agreement between you and Fenner makes 2 of those targets 1 unit. It's more complicated for him. And if he goes after the Caldwell land anyway? Then you deal with that when it happens. But the corridor doesn't work without your land, and your land is more defensible if you're not standing alone on it. She thought for a long moment. I'd need to go see Fenner. I know him, Gideon said. I can come with you if that's useful. She looked at him. Is it a vouching situation? Fenner's been in the county 20 years. He doesn't need vouching the way... He stopped. The way I do, she said without particular edge. Just accurate. You've been here 3 months, he said. In 3 more you won't need it. Right now, yes. It helps to not be unknown to the person you're asking to make a formal agreement with. She accepted this without the flair of independence she might have shown 3 months ago, which he noted, not because she'd gotten smaller, but because she'd gotten more precise about what was worth spending energy on. Saturday, she said. We'll go Saturday. The Fenner place was 8 miles east, past the county road, and up a slight rise to a property that had good wind protection from the north and mediocre soil that Fenner had been improving for 2 decades with a patience that had visibly paid off. Ed Fenner was 51, a wide, solid man with a permanent squint from years of working into the sun, and a manner that was cautious in the way of someone who had learned caution from specific experience rather than general temperament. He received them at the door and looked at Eliza with the focused assessment of someone making a decision about a stranger. You're Silas's niece, he said. I am, she said. Ed Fenner. That's right. He looked at Gideon. Hail. Fenner. Thanks for seeing us. They went inside. Ed's wife, Ruth, brought coffee and then stationed herself at a chair in the corner with knitting that she attended to with the productive attention of a woman who intended to be present for the conversation without inserting herself unless she had something worth inserting. Eliza laid out what she knew about Greer's corridor plan clearly and without editorializing, and Gideon watched Ed Fenner's face as she talked. The cautious expression didn't change much. Fenner had been in the county long enough to have heard most of this already. But there was a moment when she described the contingent pricing on the Caldwell offer where something sharpened. He tied the Caldwell price to the full corridor, Fenner said. That's what I understand, Eliza said. Which means if you and I both hold, the Caldwell price drops significantly. It doesn't stop them from selling. They have their own reasons, but it changes the calculation. Fenner looked at his coffee. The Caldwells are going through it, he said. June's mother is bad. I know, Eliza said. I'm not trying to prevent them from making the decision that's right for their family. I'm trying to make sure that Greer's pressure on them doesn't translate into pressure on us. Fenner looked at her steadily. It was the look of a man deciding something. What kind of agreement are you talking about? He said. Right of first offer, Eliza said. Documented. If either of us reaches the point of considering a sale, the other has first opportunity to purchase at market rate before we go to any outside buyer. That doesn't bind us to stay, Ruth said from the corner without looking up from her knitting. No, Eliza said. It doesn't bind anyone to anything except honoring each other's right to be the first to know. She paused. It also signals to Greer that we're in communication, that we know what he's doing. That changes his approach. Ruth looked up then. She and Fenner exchanged the look of people who had been making decisions together for long enough that the conversation happened in a glance. Draw it up, Fenner said. Bring it by next week. I'll look at it. Eliza thanked him without making it large. She thanked Ruth as well, which Ruth acknowledged with a small nod that had approval in it. Outside, riding back toward the county road, Gideon looked at her. You had that prepared, he said. The specific language. I had 3 versions, she said. That was the middle one, the one I thought he'd accept. What were the others? One was more aggressive, a mutual non-compete with Greer specifically named. Too exposed legally, and Fenner would have walked. She paused. The third was just a letter of intent with no binding terms. Too weak to be meaningful. You've done this kind of thing before, he said. I've never done this kind of thing before, she said. I thought about it very carefully on Friday night. He looked at her profile against the winter white of the landscape, the serious set of her face, the particular way she held the reins in her left hand with the gloved fingers. She'd stopped hiding the hand entirely sometime in the past 2 weeks, he'd noticed. Not displaying it, just not hiding it. It was out where it was. "Eliza," he said. She looked at him. "I want to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me get through it before you redirect it somewhere practical." She looked at him for a moment. "All right." He looked at the lane ahead. "I was wrong about you when you got off that stagecoach. Not about the winter. I told you the truth about the winter, but about you. I decided what you were before I had any evidence for it, because—" He stopped, found the honest version. "Because it was easier than actually looking. I'd been not looking at most things for 3 years, and it had become a habit I didn't recognize as a habit." She was quiet. "I recognized it because of you," he said, "because you kept being what you actually were instead of what I decided. And eventually the gap between those two things was too big to keep ignoring." He kept his eyes on the road. "I want you to know I see it now. What you are. What you've built here." A pause. "What you're going to build." The silence after that was the particular kind that follows something said truthfully after being held for too long. It had a different quality from the usual silences. Fuller, somehow. Like something that had needed to take up space had finally been given it. "Thank you," she said. It was not a deflection. It was the real thing. They rode the rest of the way in the full silence. January came in hard and stayed. It was the kind of January that justified every warning Gideon had given that first day and every preparation Eliza had made since, and there were days when both of them worked independently at their own properties, because the cold and the logistics made the 15 minutes between them a meaningful barrier. Those days had their own rhythm, the necessary tasks that couldn't be deferred, the short hours of usable light, the careful husbanding of wood and food and lamplight that became instinctive by the third week. But the in-between days, the days when the cold had an edge rather than a wall, when the channel could be checked in less than an hour, and the rest of the day remained, those days they found each other. Sometimes he came to her. Sometimes she appeared at his fence line and he saw her from the barn and went to meet her. The pretext had thinned to nearly nothing. Neither of them was pretending the visits were entirely about the channel or the barn or any specific logistical concern. One afternoon in the middle of January, with the light going early and the temperature doing what it did in the deep middle of winter in Wyoming, they were sitting at her kitchen table with the lamp going and a hand of cards between them. She'd found a deck in Silas's belongings, and they'd been playing a game neither of them was particularly good at that. They'd more or less invented from 2 half-remembered versions of different games, and she looked up from her cards and said, "What do you want, Gideon?" He looked up. She held his gaze. "From this? What do you want from it?" He set down his cards. The lamp between them was steady. The fire was steady. Outside it was dark and cold, and the world was reduced to its essentials, which he'd come to believe was Wyoming's particular way of clarifying what mattered. "I want to stop pretending I come here for the channel," he said. She waited. "I want—" He stopped. Started again. "I've been alone for 3 years, and I told myself it was what I needed, and I wasn't wrong for a while. But I want to stop. I want to stop coming and going and treating this like something that doesn't have a name." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the exposure of having said it clearly. "I'm not ready to be certain," she said, finally. "Not about what I want to be certain about." She said it without apology, but also without withdrawal. "I want you to know I'm not being careful because I don't feel something. I'm being careful because I do. And I lost someone before, and I know what that costs." "I know what it costs," he said. "I know you do." She looked at the cards on the table. "I'm asking for time." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked back up at him. Something in her expression settled. "I know," she said. And then, "That's part of why I'm asking." He picked up his cards. They finished the game. He stayed until it was later than was technically reasonable and went home in the cold dark on the 15-minute ride between their properties, which did not feel like 15 minutes in either direction anymore. The Caldwells left in late January. June Caldwell came to Eliza's door 3 days before they loaded the wagon, and they sat together at the kitchen table for an hour, and June cried, which she'd apparently needed to do for several weeks and hadn't, and Eliza made coffee and let her, because sometimes what you needed from another person was simply not to be told things were all right. "I don't want to go," June said. "I know," Eliza said, "but my mother—" "You don't have to explain," Eliza said. "It's the right decision. You know it is." "Walt Greer's going to be impossible," June said, wiping her face. "He's going to own half this valley within 5 years at this rate." "He's not going to own your land or the Fenners' land," Eliza said. "We've filed the agreement." June looked at her. "Ed Fenner and I," Eliza said. "The right of first offer. It's in the county register as of December." She'd done it quietly, through the county office, with a letter from a solicitor in Cheyenne that Gideon had helped her contact. "Greer knows about it. He's not happy." June looked at her for a moment. "He came to see you again?" "He sent a letter," Eliza said. "Very polite, very pointed." She picked up her coffee. "I wrote back, also polite." June laughed, a short, watery laugh that was better than the crying. "You're going to be fine," she said. "You know that?" "I know it more than I did in September," Eliza said honestly. June left, and 2 days later the Caldwells' wagon went east down the county road, and Eliza watched it from her fence line and felt the particular sadness of watching someone leave a place you're committed to staying in. It was the sadness of divergence, the point where one road went on and another turned. Gideon came that evening. She didn't have to tell him why she was quieter than usual. He knew where the Caldwell wagon had gone. They sat at her table. "Greer will have the land surveyed within the month," Gideon said. "I know. His cattle will be on the north pasture by spring." "I know that too." She looked at the lamp. "I've been thinking about the spring planting. If I put the north field into something he doesn't want adjacent to his cattle." "What did you have in mind?" "Flax," she said. "He'll hate it. His cattle will avoid the north fence entirely." Gideon looked at her. "The lower field goes into feed corn," she said. "That's actually productive. The north field is a buffer. I'll take a smaller yield there, but it's worth the trade-off for the fence integrity." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good plan," he said. "It's a necessary plan," she said. "There's a difference." "Eliza." She looked up. "I know there's a difference," he said. "I'm saying it's also good." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the lamp, and something in her face shifted, the planning and the calculation moving aside briefly for something more personal. "He doesn't scare me," she said. "Walt Greer. He doesn't scare me, but he makes me tired in a specific way, like a problem that shouldn't require this much energy." She paused. "I didn't come here to fight someone. I came here to build something." "You're doing both," he said. "I know." She turned her left hand over on the table, palm up. The glove was there, as always, but the gesture was not defensive. It was more like an acknowledgement. "I know. I just wanted to say it out loud to someone." "Say it whenever you need to," he said. She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them and the winter dark outside the window and the fire doing what fires do when you've banked them right, which is burn long and steady without requiring constant attention. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah." "Stay for dinner." He did. February was the month that tested everything, which was what February in Wyoming was designed to do. The cold that January had delivered with force, February refined into something more personal. Not the brutal directness of the deep winter storms, but the slow, grinding pressure of a season that had been going on long enough that the resources you'd prepared with such care in autumn were now visibly diminishing. The woodpile against the cabin's north wall was down to the last third. The preserved stores were adequate, but no longer generous. The horses had developed the particular lean quality that horses got in the final weeks before spring grass, where you could see the work of the winter in their bodies, no matter how carefully you'd managed the feed. Eliza did her accounting on a Thursday evening in the first week of February, Sitting at her kitchen table with the lamp turned as low as she could manage, while still being able to read her own figures. It was a habit she'd developed without planning to. The weekly accounting, the running tally of what remained against what was still needed. It was not a comfortable exercise. It was a necessary one. The numbers were not bad. They were not comfortable, but they were not bad. She would make it to spring with a margin. Thin, but real. The flaxseed she'd ordered for the north field had arrived before the January cold locked the roads, and it was stored in the barn. The lower field soil had frozen hard over the winter in the way that good agricultural soil froze, deep and clean, which meant the thaw would release nutrients rather than wash them. She'd read enough about Wyoming agriculture by now to know that was not guaranteed and was therefore not something to take lightly. She closed the ledger. She sat for a while looking at the lamp. She thought about what she'd told Gideon in January, when he'd asked what she wanted from this, from the land, from the building, from the life she was assembling piece by deliberate piece in the cold. She hadn't given him the full answer, because the full answer required being more certain than she'd been, and she'd asked for time, and he'd given it without making her feel the weight of the giving. She thought she was closer to certain now. She thought what was happening was that she was no longer afraid of being certain. That was not the same thing as certainty itself, but it was closer than she'd been in September, or November, or even January. Something had shifted in the months of working beside him, of being seen clearly and not diminished by the seeing, of having a person who knocked on her door in a blizzard because he couldn't not come and then did not make her feel that the debt of it required anything from her. Thomas had been like that too, in his way. Direct, steady, not interested in debts or performances. She'd spent 5 years thinking that was unrepeatable, a specific configuration of a specific person that didn't come in other forms. She was revising that. Gideon came on Saturday with a problem. She saw it in his face when he arrived. Not distress exactly, but the particular set of his jaw that meant he was carrying something he hadn't decided how to put down yet. She'd learned to read him well enough to know the difference between the working expression and the thinking expression and the carrying something expression, and this was the third one. She made coffee without asking. He sat at the table. Walt Greer filed a complaint with the county about the water channel, he said. She went still. What kind of complaint? Diversion without permit. Gideon wrapped his hands around the cup. He's claiming that the channel we dug constitutes a diversion of water from the main creek without a county permit, which technically, is a filing requirement that neither of us addressed. She sat down. Is he right? About the technicality? Yes. He looked at her. About the substance? No. The water we're accessing was already designated under the original 1874 rights documentation, and a secondary channel within the same property system isn't a diversion in the meaningful sense. But it gives him grounds for a county hearing, and county hearings take time and cost money, and he knows that, she said. He knows that. She was quiet for a moment, thinking through it. When is the hearing? March 3rd, 5 weeks. Can we resolve the permit issue before the hearing? The permit office says 8 to 12 weeks for standard applications. She looked at the table. This was what Greer did, she understood now. Not frontal attacks, but procedural friction. He didn't need to win the hearing. He needed to create enough cost and complication that smaller operations concluded the fight wasn't worth it. It was effective because it was patient, and patience was a thing he could afford more of than most. She thought of June Caldwell's wagon going down the county road in January and the particular weight of watching it go. She looked up. The 1874 documentation. Do you have the original? Copy, Gideon said. The original is in the county land office. I need to see the original. She stood and went to the shelf where her agricultural manuals lived alongside the notebooks she'd filled since September. She pulled out the third notebook, the one from October, the weeks of channel work. I took measurements when we built the channel, daily measurements, flow rate, water level at the creek, the distance from the original creek bed. He looked at her. I didn't know why I was doing it exactly, she said. It seemed like the kind of thing that would be useful to know. She set the notebook on the table. If the original 1874 documentation used flow measurements to establish the rights, which it would have because that's how water rights were established in this county. In that period, I read the county procedures from 1869 through 1880 at the public library before I left Philadelphia. She stopped because he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. "What?" she said. "You read the county water rights procedures from 1869 through 1880, he said slowly, in the Philadelphia Public Library. They had county records going back to territorial organization. She looked at the notebook. I didn't know I'd need it. I thought I might. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "Eliza," he said. "Gideon, you came to Wyoming prepared to fight a water rights legal challenge." "I came prepared to understand the land I was inheriting," she said. "The water rights situation was in my uncle's papers. He'd been managing it for 30 years without resolution. It seemed like something I should understand." He sat back in his chair and looked at her with the expression she'd first seen on a Tuesday afternoon in October when she'd produced the 1871 survey from her satchel. The expression of someone whose estimate has just been revised upward past the point where upward revision was still surprising. "Show me the measurements," he said. She showed him. The next 2 weeks were the kind of work that didn't involve pickaxes or roof shingles, but was harder in different ways. Eliza rode to the county land office in Coldwater Flats twice in the first week, and spent 4 hours on the first trip and 6 on the second with the original 1874 documentation, which was stored in a flat drawer in the records room and smelled like the particular combination of old paper and dust that meant nobody had looked at it in a very long time. The county clerk, a thin man named Aldous Marsh, who had the focused skepticism of someone who'd been manipulated by paperwork before and was accordingly careful with everyone, watched her work on the first day with visible uncertainty about what she was doing and visible recalibration by the end of it. "You understand what you're reading," he said when she'd been working for 2 hours. "I'm familiar with the documentation format," she said. "I studied county records procedures in Philadelphia." Aldous Marsh looked at her over his spectacles. "You're the Rowan woman, the new one." "I've been here since September," she said. "So fairly new, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Greer filed that complaint personally," he said. "Came in himself. Usually he sends his man." She looked up from the document. "He came himself." "That's right." Aldous Marsh went back to whatever he'd been doing before she arrived, but she understood what he'd offered her and she appreciated it. Greer had come himself because this one mattered enough for his personal attention, which meant the corridor mattered more than the approach suggested, which meant the Fenner agreement had landed harder than Greer had shown. She made careful notes and went home. On the second visit, she found what she was looking for in the appendix to the 1874 filing, a measurement table that established the water rights in terms of flow volume rather than physical location, which was the thing she'd suspected and needed to confirm. If the rights were defined by volume and not by the specific channel position, then the secondary channel wasn't a diversion at all. It was a delivery mechanism for water already legally allocated. The permit requirement applied to diversions of unallocated water. Their channel didn't qualify. She explained this to Gideon that evening at his kitchen table with the documents spread between them and watched him follow the logic through to its conclusion. "That's the argument," he said. "It needs someone who can present it formally," she said. "A solicitor. The man in Cheyenne who did the Fenner agreement." "I've already written to him," she said. "He replied this morning. He says the argument is sound. He can file a response to the complaint within the week." Gideon looked at her. "I wrote Monday," she said, "when you first told me." He laughed. Not the short, involuntary kind, the fuller one, the one that came from somewhere deeper, the one she'd been seeing more of in recent weeks, and that she understood now was what he looked like when he wasn't managing what he showed. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He shook his head. "I came here Saturday expecting to tell you we had a serious problem." "We do have a serious problem," she said. "It's just also a solvable one. Most problems are. Most people don't look long enough to find how," she said. He looked at her across the table with the documents between them and the lamp between them and the months of everything between them, and she held the look without deflecting it. "Eliza," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't know what I was going to say." I have a reasonable idea, she said. He stood up from the table, which meant he was either leaving or doing something else. And he didn't take his coat, which meant he wasn't leaving. And he came around the table and she looked up at him and he looked down at her. And the distance between them was the small, specific kind that requires a decision to cross. He reached down and took her right hand, the bare one, the uncomplicated one, and held it in both of his. I'm done being careful about this, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever time you need is yours. But I'm done pretending I don't know what this is. She stood up. She was almost his height, which she'd never particularly noticed until they were standing this close. I'm done being careful too, she said. I think I finished being careful about it sometime in January and didn't say so. Why didn't you say so? Because you were being careful, she said, and it seemed like you needed to get there yourself. He looked at her for a long moment. You were waiting for me. I was giving you room, she said. There's a difference. He brought her hand up slightly, just slightly, and she understood that this was him being careful one more time, making sure, giving her the room she'd given him. She stepped in and closed what was left of the distance. The county hearing on March 3rd was shorter than Greer had intended. The solicitor from Cheyenne, a compact, precise man named Daniel Whitfield, who had the manner of someone who found procedural problems genuinely interesting rather than tedious, filed the response 3 weeks before the hearing, which gave the county commissioner time to review it, and the commissioner's review was apparent in his expression when the hearing opened. He had the look of a man who had already read the answer and found it persuasive. Greer was there himself, with his own legal representative. He was charming and confident when he came in, and he was still charming when he left because he didn't let things show that he didn't choose to show. And Eliza respected that about him even as she recognized it as the same quality deployed against her interests. The commissioner ruled in her favor, and Gideon's within 40 minutes. The water channel was legal. The 1874 documentation was definitive. The permit requirement did not apply. Greer's complaint was dismissed. Walking out of the county building into the early March air, which was still cold but had a different quality than February's cold, something tentative beginning in it, the first suggestion of a direction other than winter, Eliza stopped on the steps and let herself have the moment fully. Not triumphantly, just completely. The particular satisfaction of a problem correctly understood and correctly solved, which was its own separate satisfaction from winning, though the two coincided here. Gideon came to stand beside her. Well, he said. Well, she said. Ed Fenner, who had come to the hearing as a supporting party, appeared behind them and put a hand briefly on Gideon's shoulder. Good day, he said, which from Ed Fenner was a speech. They rode back to Coldwater Flats 3 abreast on the county road, and Eliza thought about the road she'd arrived on in September. The stagecoach, the wrong-colored coat, the trunk she'd carried herself because Gideon Hale had told her she wouldn't last a month, and she'd been too angry to accept help from him. She thought about how she'd been right not to accept it then. Not because the help would have been wrong, but because she'd needed to know, for her own accounting, what she was capable of when she started from nothing. She'd needed to see that number clearly before she let anyone else hold part of the weight. She knew it now. March moved into April, and the land came back in the way that land in Wyoming came back. Not gently, but with a kind of contained urgency, as though it had been waiting with impatience for the snow to clear so it could get on with things. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. The channel held and directed the flow exactly as they'd designed it the previous October, and the Eastfield incursion from the December blizzard was tamped down and redirected before it could establish itself as a permanent feature. Eliza planted the North Field with flax on an afternoon in late April, which was not Gideon's land and not his project, but he was there anyway, helping her run the rows straight, and she let him be there because there was no longer a reason to maintain the distinction between what was hers alone and what was theirs together. The lower field went into feed corn 2 weeks later. The mare, whose official name in Eliza's ledger was listed as difficult, which had been a working description that had hardened into a name, had settled into a personality that was still opinionated but no longer unpredictably so. She had preferences about who handled her and how, and she communicated these preferences clearly and expected them to be considered, which Eliza found she respected. The mayor had come to accept Gideon sometime in February, which he noted without making a production of it. "She's decided you're all right," Eliza said. "High praise," he said. "From her, yes," she said. "She doesn't give it easily." He had looked at her when she said it, with the expression that had become one of her favorite things about his face, the one that indicated he was holding something he'd decided to feel instead of say. She had come to understand over these months that this was how he loved things, quietly, with full attention, without requiring the love to be performed. It was the same way he checked the channel and maintained the fence and remembered what she'd mentioned in passing weeks ago. He loved things through sustained, specific attention, and she had learned to receive it as the substantial thing it was. She had learned this because it was how she loved things too, and recognizing your own nature in someone else was one of the stranger and more clarifying experiences available. Walt Greer did not disappear. Men like Walt Greer didn't disappear. They recalibrated and they waited and they looked for the next opening, and Eliza was not naive enough to think the water rights hearing had concluded anything except this particular battle. Greer still owned the Caldwell land. His cattle were running in the north pasture through the spring, and the fence line required more attention than it had before. And the flax had indeed kept his cattle away from the shared fence, but had also required her to accept a thinner yield from that field as a cost. There were ongoing costs. There would continue to be ongoing costs. This was the nature of the situation, and she'd made her peace with it clearly, without sentimentality. But she also had something Greer was discovering was harder to acquire than land. In June, the Fenners invited them to dinner, both of them, together, with the easy assumption of a couple that Ruth Fenner deployed in the invitation without commentary, and which Eliza received without correction. It was the first time they'd been received that way publicly and explicitly, and sitting at the Fenners' table with Ed's quiet solidity and Ruth's sharp wit and the good food and the particular warmth of people who had made something durable together and were willing to share it, Eliza felt something settle in her that she hadn't known was still waiting to settle. Belonging was not the same as acceptance. She'd had acceptance from the quilting circle in October, had had it from Ed Fenner in December, had earned it gradually in the way it was earned in places like this, through presence, through competence, through being consistently who you said you were. Belonging was different. It was when the place started to include you in its own understanding of itself, when you stopped being the Rowan woman from Philadelphia and became simply someone of the valley, with a stake in it and a history in it, however short. She felt it at the Fenners' table. She felt it on the ride home with Gideon when they passed the fence line between their properties without marking it as a boundary. She felt it most in the small ordinary things, the mare knowing her footstep before she opened the barn door in the morning, the lower field's corn standing green and straight in the July light, the channel running clear through its second summer, handling the flow exactly as it was supposed to, the crib timbers worn and useful and showing the marks of the work that had built them. On a Saturday in late July, Gideon came to her property in the early evening, and she was sitting on the porch in the last of the day's warmth, which had become a habit she'd allowed herself as the summer made the evenings good for sitting. He came around the corner of the cabin and stopped when he saw her. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. She looked at him. His jaw had the set of the carrying something expression, but this was a different carrying, lighter, she thought, more like anticipation than weight. "Sit down," she said. He sat on the step below her, which put them at almost the same level, and he looked out at the lower field where the corn was doing what corn did in the good part of summer, which was grow with a visible confidence that was its own kind of pleasure to watch. "I think we should combine the operations," he said. "The properties. Formally." He didn't look at her yet. "Not just the channel, the whole thing. Fence lines, planting decisions, livestock, whatever the winter brings." Paused. "Together." She looked at the side of his face. "That's the practical version," he said. "There's another version." "I know there is," she said. He looked at her then. "Will you marry me, Eliza?" She thought about the stagecoach steps in September, and the coat that was the wrong color for Wyoming, and the man who'd looked at her and decided in 3 seconds what she was and what she couldn't do. She thought about the rope in the blizzard and the lamp she'd carried from Philadelphia, and the numbers in the ledger and the scar on her arm, and Thomas and Martha, and all the specific weight of everything that had been carried and set down, and carried differently. She thought about the puzzle she'd been solving piece by piece since the day she'd arrived. "Yes," she said. He reached up and took her hand, the left one, the gloved one, and held it in both of his the way he had in February, and this time she pulled the glove off herself. Slowly, deliberately, without ceremony. She folded it in her lap and left her hand in his. He looked at the scar the way he'd looked at it the first time he'd seen it clearly, in the barn in December. Not with pity, with the specific quiet attention of someone reading something that mattered. "You don't have to cover it," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "I stopped covering it because I was ashamed of it a long time ago. I covered it because—" She looked at it herself, in his hands, in the July evening light. "Because it was mine. The story was mine, and I wasn't ready to share it with anyone who hadn't earned it." "Have I earned it?" She looked at him. "You rode out in a blizzard," she said. "You fixed my roof and dug half a water channel and talked to Tom Beale about prices without telling me, and then admitted you should have told me and didn't argue when I said you were right." She paused. "You said Thomas sounded like a man worth grieving." He was quiet. "Yes," she said. "You've earned it." They married in September, 1 year and 2 weeks after Eliza had stepped off the stagecoach in Coldwater Flats with clean boots and a coat the wrong color for Wyoming. It was a small ceremony, which suited them both. Ed and Ruth Fenner were there, Clara Henshaw and her husband. Margaret Pruitt, who cried in the particular way of someone who had been hoping for this outcome and was gratified to have been right. Young Cal Pruitt, who was now 17 and had graduated from driving women's wagons under duress to something approaching genuine respect for Eliza, who had hired him 3 times over the summer for honest work at honest pay. June Caldwell had sent a letter from Ohio. She was well. Her mother was better. She was expecting a child in the spring. She wrote, "I'm so glad you stayed, Eliza. Someone needed to." The Rowan cabin and the Hale property were connected legally within the month, the fence line between them reduced to a record in the county register, and a physical marker that neither of them paid much attention to in practice. They worked the combined land as one operation, which was what it had been in practice for nearly a year, and what it was now, in fact. The differences in their approaches, which were real, which did not disappear because they'd married, became something they negotiated as they went, with varying success and occasional stubbornness on both sides. She was more systematic. He was more intuitive. She planned further out. He responded faster to what was actually happening in front of him. They were, in the way of different people who are genuinely compatible, better at the whole problem together than either was at their half of it. Walt Greer made one more attempt, the following spring, through a different procedural angle involving grazing rights on the county road easement that ran along their north border. Daniel Whitfield handled it from Cheyenne with the same compact efficiency as before and the same result. And after that, Greer turned his attention to easier targets further south, and the valley north of Coldwater Flats settled into a period of something like equilibrium. It would not last forever. Nothing did. There would be other Greers, other dry summers, other unexpected costs. This was the nature of the country and the nature of the life they'd chosen, and they'd both chosen it clear-eyed enough to know what they were accepting when they accepted it. There is something that happens when a person builds a life from the actual material of a hard place without pretending the place is softer than it is. Not confidence exactly. Confidence sounds too certain, too finished, more like a settled knowledge of the difference between what you can control and what you can't, and a genuine peace with the boundary between them. Eliza had been building that knowledge since September, piece by piece, the way she'd taught the small boy to read, one piece of the puzzle at a time, never named directly, until one day the whole shape of it was legible. She hadn't known, on the stagecoach from Philadelphia, whether she was capable of this life. She'd suspected she was. She'd prepared as though she was. But suspicion and preparation were not the same as knowledge, and the knowledge had only come from the doing. What she'd found, in the doing, was something she hadn't expected and hadn't prepared for. That the capacity she'd been trying to prove to herself had been visible all along to the people willing to look without the particular kind of blindness that decides in advance what a woman from a city can and cannot do. Silas had seen it, in the letters he'd written every 6 months for years, about the kitchen garden and the winter and the ordinary, faithful business of paying attention to your own life. Thomas had seen it and had loved her for it, and she carried his memory not as a wound anymore, but as a truth about herself that his seeing had confirmed. Gideon had taken longer to see it, but when he saw it, he'd looked without flinching, and he'd revised his judgment without being asked to, and he'd never pretended he hadn't been wrong. That, she had decided, was a kind of courage too. Not the dramatic kind. Not running into burning buildings or fighting through blizzards, though he'd done that too. The quieter kind. The willingness to see something you'd missed and say so plainly and not dress it in defense. She thought about this sometimes on the porch in the evenings, in the second summer and the third, while the valley went gold in the failing light and the horses moved in the pasture and the water ran in the channel they'd built together from a creek, and a good idea and a shared understanding that some problems were best solved with a shovel. The scar on her wrist had become something she no longer thought to cover, not because it had stopped being part of her history, but because her history had expanded far enough around it that it was one thing among many rather than the thing that defined the whole. Children came to the ranch sometimes. The Fenner grandchildren, a niece of Manny Pruitt's who visited from Cheyenne in summers and could not stay away from the horses. They noticed the scar the way children noticed things they didn't understand, directly, without the social management that adults applied to their curiosity. "What happened to your arm?" one of the Fenner grandchildren asked, a girl of about 9, one August afternoon, when Eliza was showing her how to properly check a horse's hooves. "I got burned," Eliza said, "a long time ago." "Does it still hurt?" "Sometimes," she said, "when the weather changes." The girl considered this seriously, the way 9-year-olds considered things they found genuinely interesting. "But you can still do things." "Yes," Eliza said, "you can still do things." She handed the girl the hoof pick and let her try. That evening on the porch, she told Gideon what the girl had asked. He was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "That you can still do things," Eliza said. He looked at the light going out of the sky above the ridgeline. "That's true," he said. "It's the part that matters," she said. He reached over and took her left hand, the scarred one, the bare one, and held it the way he'd learned to hold it, not carefully, not as though it required special handling, just the way you held something that was yours and that you intended to keep. They sat on the porch in the good light of the end of summer and looked at the valley that was theirs and the life they'd built in it, which was not the life either of them had expected, and which was, in the particular way of things that required genuine effort to earn, exactly right. The land didn't owe them anything. It had never pretended to. What it offered was a place to work and the honest outcome of that work. And they had both known coming in that this was what was being offered, and they had both accepted the terms. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the country to be kinder than it is. Some people understand, finally, that the kindness is not in the country. It's in what you build and who you build it with, and whether you have the willingness to look at another person clearly and let them look back. Eliza Rowan had come to Wyoming to find out what she was capable of. She'd found out. And then she'd found something better than what she'd come looking for, which was a person who'd made the same discovery about himself at almost the same time, and had had the sense to recognize it for what it was. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything.